Demonology by King James I. Preface. The alarming proliferation within this nation, at this present time, of those abhorrent servants of the devil, the witches or enchanters, has compelled me, beloved reader, to hasten the publication of this ensuing treatise of mine. It is in no way intended, as I protest, to serve as a display of my scholarly learning and intellect, but solely, moved by conscience, to strive thereby, as far as I am able, to resolve the doubting hearts of many, demonstrating both that such assaults by Satan are most assuredly practiced, and that the instruments thereof merit the most severe punishment. Against the damnable opinions of two principal figures in our age, the first of whom, an Englishman named Scott, is not ashamed to publicly deny in print that such a phenomenon as witchcraft can exist. And thus, he maintains the ancient error of the Sadducees in denying the existence of spirits. The other, a German physician named Johann Weyer, issues a public apology for all such practitioners, whereby, in advocating for their impunity, he clearly betrays himself as having been a member of that very profession. And to render this treatise more agreeable and accessible, I have structured it in the form of a dialogue, which I have divided into 3 books. The first speaking of magic in general and necromancy in particular. The second concerns sorcery and witchcraft. And the third contains a discourse regarding all these classifications of spirits and specters that manifest and torment individuals, together with a conclusion to the entire work. My intention in this labor is solely to prove 2 matters, as I have already stated. The one, that such diabolical arts have existed and continue to exist. The other, what exact trial and severe punishment they rightfully merit. And therefore I reason what nature of feats are possible to be performed through these arts, and by what natural causes they may occur. I do not intend to address every particular aspect of the devil's power, for that would be an infinite task, but rather to speak in a scholastic manner, since this cannot be adequately expressed in our vernacular. I shall reason upon the genus, leaving the species and differentia to be comprehended therein. As an example, when speaking of the power of magicians in the 1st book and 6th chapter, I state that they can suddenly cause all manner of delicate dishes to be brought unto them by their familiar spirit, since, like a thief, he delights in stealing, and as a spirit, he can transport the items with sufficient subtlety and suddenness. Now, under this genus, all subsequent particulars may be comprehended, depending thereupon, such as drawing wine out of a wall, a feat we have frequently heard to have been practiced, and similar actions which particulars are sufficiently proven by the reasoning applied to the general category. And similarly in the 2nd book concerning witchcraft specifically, and the 5th chapter one assert and prove through diverse arguments that witches can, by the power of their master, cure or inflict diseases. Now, by these identical reasons that prove their general power over diseases through the devil, their specific power is likewise proven, as in the weakening of the constitution of certain men, to render them impotent with women, and in causing such virility to abound in others, far beyond what the ordinary course of nature would permit, and similarly in all other particular afflictions. But there is one matter I will pray you to observe in all these instances, where I reason upon the devil's power, which is the divergent ends and objectives, that God as the primary cause, and the devil as his instrument and secondary cause aim for in all these actions of the devil as God's executioner. For while the devil's intention in these matters is always to destroy, either the soul or the body, or both of them, of those he is permitted to afflict, God, to the contrary, constantly draws glory to himself out of that evil, whether through the ruin of the wicked by his justice, or through the testing of the patient, and the improvement of the faithful, who are awakened by that rod of correction. Having thus declared unto you my full intention in this treatise, you will easily excuse, I do not doubt, my omission in detailing the comprehensive particular rites and secrets of these unlawful arts, as well as their infinite and astonishing practices, since neither is pertinent to my purpose. The reason for this is provided at the conclusion of the first chapter of the third book. And whoever wishes to indulge their curiosity regarding these matters, they may read, if they desire to hear of such practices, Botanus's Daemonomany, a work compiled with greater diligence than it was written with judgment, alongside the confessions of those who have recently been apprehended. If one should wish to know what has been the opinion of the ancients concerning their power, he shall find it thoroughly described by Hyperius and Hemingius, two recent German writers, besides innumerable other neoteric theologians who write extensively upon that subject. And if he should desire to know the specific rites and curiosities of these black arts, which is an inquiry both unnecessary and perilous, he will find them detailed in the fourth book of Cornelius Agrippa, and in the writings of Johann Weyer, of whom I have already spoken. And so, wishing my labors in this treatise, beloved reader, to be effective in arming all those who read it against the aforementioned errors, and recommending my goodwill to your friendly acceptance, I bid you a hearty farewell. King James I. Chapter 1. Argument. Proven by Scripture that these unlawful arts engineer have been and may continue to be put into practice. Philomaths and Epistmen reason upon the matter. Philomaths, I am certainly most pleased to have encountered you this day, for I am of the opinion that you can better resolve a matter for me, about which I stand in profound doubt, than anyone else I might have met. Epistmen, in whatever capacity I am able, regarding that which you wish to ask of me, I shall willingly and freely offer my opinion, and should I fail to prove it sufficiently, I am entirely content to let a superior argument prevail then. Philomaths, what do you make of this strange news, which currently provides the sole topic of conversation for all men at their meeting? I refer to these witches. Epistmen, they are undoubtedly astonishing, and I believe that such clear and unequivocal confessions regarding this matter have never before occurred in any age or country. Philomaths, there is no question if they are true, but the learned doctors harbor doubts upon that very point. Epistmen, what aspect of it do you doubt? Philomaths, truly I doubt all of it from what I can currently perceive, and specifically, whether there is such a phenomenon as witchcraft or witches, and I would entreat you to resolve this for me if you are able. For I have reasoned with various individuals on this matter, and yet I could never find satisfaction therein. Epistmen, I shall willingly do the best I can. However, I believe it will prove more difficult, since you deny the existence of the thing itself in general. For as it is stated in the schools of logic, there can be no debate with one who denies the foundational principles. Nevertheless, regarding the assertion that witchcraft and witches have existed and continue to exist, the former point is clearly proven by the Scriptures, and the latter by daily experience and confessions. Philomaths, I know you will present to me the example of Saul's Pythoness, but that, as it appears, will not serve your argument greatly. Epistmen, not only that instance but various others. Yet I marvel at why that should not serve my argument well. Philomaths, The reasons are as follows. First, you may consider that Saul was troubled in spirit, and having fasted long before, as the text testifies, and having come to a woman who was rumored to possess such knowledge, and did so to inquire after news of the utmost importance, bearing a profoundly guilty conscience for his heinous offenses, and specifically for that same unlawful curiosity and horrible defection. And then the woman crying out suddenly in great astonishment at the bizarre apparition she alleged to have seen, recognizing him to be the king, although he was disguised, and had previously denied his identity. It was no wonder, I say, that his senses being thus distracted, he could not perceive the feigning of her voice, as he was himself in another chamber, and saw nothing. Next, what could be, or indeed was raised? The spirit of Samuel? Profane and against all theology. The devil in his likeness? It is equally implausible that either God would permit him to come in the shape of his saints, for then the prophets in those days could never have been certain what spirit spoke to them in their visions, or that he could foretell what was to come thereafter, for prophecy proceeds solely from God. And the devil has no knowledge of things to come. Epistmen. Yet if you will mark the words of the text, you will find clearly that Saul saw that apparition. For granting you that Saul was in another chamber, at the making of the circles and conjurations, needful for that purpose, as none of that craft will permit any others to behold at that time, yet it is evident by the text that as soon as that unclean spirit was fully risen, she called upon Saul. For it is said in the text that Saul knew him to be Samuel, which could not have been, by merely hearing an account of an old man with a mantle, since there were many more old men dead in Israel than Samuel. And the common attire of that whole country was mantles. As to the next point, that it was not the spirit of Samuel, I grant, in the proving whereof you need not to insist, since all Christians of whatsoever religion agree upon that, and none but either mere ignorance, or necromancers or witches doubt thereof, and that the devil is permitted at some times to put himself in the likeness of the saints. It is plain in the Scriptures, where it is said that Satan can transform himself into an angel of light. Neither could that bring any inconvenience to the visions of the prophets, since it is most certain that God will not permit him so to deceive his own, but only such as first willfully deceive themselves by running unto him, whom God then suffers to fall in their own snares, and justly permits them to be elude with great efficacy of deceit, because they would not believe the truth, as Paul says. And as to the devil's foretelling of things to come, it is true that he knows not all future things, but yet that he knows a part. The tragical event of this history declares it, which the wit of woman could never have prophesied, not that he has any prescience, which is exclusively proper to God, or yet knows anything by looking upon God, as in a mirror, as the good angels do, he being forever debarred from the favorable presence and countenance of his Creator, but only by one of these two means, either as being worldly wise, and taught by a continual experience, ever since the creation, he judges by the likelihood of things to come, according to the like that has passed before, and the natural causes, in respect of the vicissitude of all things, worldly, or else by God's employing of him in a specific turn, and thus foreseen thereof, as appears to have been in this instance, whereof we find the exact equivalent in Micaiah's prophetic discourse to King Ahab. But to prove this my first proposition, that there can be such a thing as witchcraft and witches, there are many more places in the Scriptures than this, as I said before. As first in the law of God, it is plainly prohibited. But certain it is, that the law of God speaks nothing in vain, neither does it lay curses, or enjoin punishments upon shadows, condemning that to be evil, which is not in essence or being as we term it. Secondly, it is plain, where wicked Pharaoh's wise men imitated a number of Moses's miracles, to harden the tyrant's heart thereby. Thirdly, said not Samuel to Saul, that disobedience is as the sin of witchcraft. To compare to a thing that did not exist, it would be entirely absurd. Fourthly, was not Simon Magus a man of that craft? And fifthly, what was she that had the spirit of Python? Beside innumerable other places that would be irksome to recite. Chapter 2. Argument. What kind of sin the practitioners of these unlawful arts commit. The division of these arts. And what are the means that allure anyone to practice them? Philomaths. But I consider it highly strange that God should permit any of mankind, since they bear his own image, to fall into so gross and vile a defection. Epistmen. Although man in his creation was made in the image of the Creator, yet through his fall having once lost it, it is but restored again in part by grace only to the elect. So all the rest falling away from God are given over into the hands of the devil, that enemy, to bear his image. And being once so given over, the greatest and the grossest impiety is the pleasantest and most delightful unto them. Philomaths. But may it not suffice him to have indirectly the rule, and procure the perdition of so many souls by alluring them to vices, and to the following of their own appetites, even supposing he did not abuse so many simple souls, in making them directly acknowledge him for their master? Epistmen. Assuredly not, for he uses every man, over whom he has the rule, according to their temperament and knowledge. And thus whom he finds most simple, he most plainly discovers himself unto them. For he, being the enemy of man's salvation, uses all the means he can to entrap them so far in his snares, as it may be impossible for them thereafter, even supposing they wished it, to rid themselves out of the same. Philomaths. Then this sin is a sin against the Holy Ghost. Epistmen. It is so in some, but not in all. Philomaths. How is that? Are not all those who run directly to the devil in one category? Epistmen. God forbid, for the sin against the Holy Ghost has two branches. The one is a falling back from the whole service of God, and a refusal of all his precepts. The other is the doing of the first with knowledge, knowing that they do wrong against their own conscience, and the testimony of the Holy Spirit, having once had a taste of the sweetness of God's mercies. Now in the first of these two, all sorts of necromancers, enchanters, or witches are comprehended. But in the latter, none but such as err with this knowledge that I have spoken of. Philomaths. Then it appears that there are more sorts than one that are directly professors of his service. And if this is so, I pray you tell me how many, and what are they? Epistmen. There are principally two sorts, unto which all the branches of that unhappy art are reduced, whereof the one is called magic or necromancy, the other sorcery or witchcraft. Philomaths. What are they, I pray you? And how many are the means whereby the devil allures persons into any of these snares? Epistmen. Even by these three passions that reside within ourselves: curiosity in great minds, thirst of revenge for some wrongs deeply apprehended, or greedy appetite for material goods caused through great poverty. As to the first of these, curiosity, it is solely the enticement of magicians or necromancers, and the other two are the allurements of the sorcerers or witches, for that old and crafty serpent, being a spirit, he easily spies our affections, and so conforms himself thereto, to deceive us to our ruin. Chapter 3. Argument. The significations and etymologies of the words of magic and necromancy. The difference between necromancy and witchcraft. What are the entryways and beginnings that bring anyone to the knowledge thereof? Philomaths, I would gladly first hear what thing it is that you call magic or necromancy. Epistmen. This word magic in the Persian tongue imparts as much as being a contemplator or interpreter of divine and heavenly sciences, which being first used among the Chaldeans, through their ignorance of the true divinity, was esteemed and reputed amongst them as a principal virtue, and therefore was unjustly named with an honorable title, which name the Greeks imitated, generally importing all these kinds of unlawful arts. And this word necromancy is a Greek word, compounded of the Greek words for the dead and for divination, which is to say, the prophecy by the dead. This latter name is bestowed upon this dark and illicit science through the figure of synecdoche, because it constitutes a principal component of that art to employ the carcasses of the dead within their divinations. Philomaths, what distinction exists between this art and witchcraft? Epistmen. Assuredly, the distinction commonly drawn between them is quite amusing, and in a manner accurate. For it is said that witches are merely servants and slaves to the devil, whereas necromancers are his masters and commanders. Philomaths, how can it be true that any men, being particularly devoted to his service, might act as his commanders? Epistmen. Indeed, they may be, but it is solely secundum quid. For it is not by any genuine power they possess over him, but ex pacto entirely, whereby he obliges himself to them in certain trifles, so that he may, in return, obtain the fruition of their body and soul, which is the singular prize he hunts for. Philomaths, a most inequitable contract, forsooth. But I pray you, discourse unto me, what are the effects and secrets of that art? Epistmen. That is an exceedingly vast field you assign to me. Nevertheless, I shall endeavor, as summarily as I am able, to traverse its principal points. Just as there are two sorts of individuals who may be enticed to this art, namely, the learned and the unlearned, so too are there two means that serve to first awaken and nourish their curiosity, thereby leading them to surrender themselves unto it. These two means I term the devil's school and his rudiments. The learned have their curiosity aroused and sustained by what I call his school. This is judicial astrology. For various men, having attained great perfection in learning yet remaining utterly bereft, alas, of the spirit of regeneration and its fruits, finding all natural phenomena to be as comprehensible to foolish pedants as to themselves, attempt to claim a more exalted reputation. They do so not solely by understanding the course of heavenly bodies, but likewise by aspiring to uncover the knowledge of future events thereby. Because the foundation of this practice initially appears lawful to them, seeming to proceed entirely from natural causes, they are immensely enticed. Discovering their methods to prove accurate in sundry matters, they delve further to discern the underlying causes. Thus, mounting from degree to degree upon the slippery and precarious ladder of curiosity, they are ultimately lured, when lawful arts or sciences fail to satisfy their restless minds, to pursue the dark and illicit science of magic. There, discovering at first that diverse configurations of circles and conjurations, correctly conjoined, will raise various forms of spirits to resolve their doubts, and attributing these occurrences to an inseparable power tied to or inherent within the circles and to the numerous names of God confusedly intertwined, they blindly glory in themselves. They act as if, through their sharpness of intellect, They had conquered Pluto's dominion and crowned themselves emperors over the Stygian habitations. Meanwhile, these miserable wretches have, in truth, become bondslaves to their mortal enemy. And despite all they presume, their knowledge is in no way increased, save in the recognition of evil and the horrors of hell as punishment for it, much as Adam's was through the consumption of the forbidden tree. Chapter 4. Argument. The description of the rudiments and school, which are the entrances into the art of magic, and, in particular, the distinctions between astronomy and astrology. The division of astrology into diverse parts. Philomaths. But I pray you, likewise, do not neglect to elucidate what constitute the devil's rudiments. Epistemon. His rudiments I define, primarily and in general terms, as everything vulgarly referred to as the virtue of word, herb, and stone, which is utilized through unlawful charms, devoid of natural causes. This likewise includes all manner of practices, superstitions, or similar extraordinary actions that cannot withstand the true scrutiny of natural reason. Philomaths, I would ask that you render this clearer through specific examples, for your proposition is exceedingly general. Epistemon. I refer to such charms as foolish women commonly employ for the healing of bewitched livestock, or for preserving them from the evil eye by tying branches of rowan or diverse sorts of herbs to the hair or tails of the animals. This encompasses curing the worm, stemming bleeding, healing equine lameness, turning the sieve, or performing innumerable similar acts through mere words, without applying any suitable remedy to the afflicted area as physicians would. Alternatively, it includes preventing married couples from naturally consummating their union by tying numerous knots upon a cord at the time of their wedding, alongside similar practices that people engage in for their amusement. For when unlettered men, being naturally curious and lacking the true knowledge of God, discover these practices to be effective, as several of them will, through the power of the devil to deceive mankind, rather than through any inherent virtue within these vain words and superstitions, and harbor a desire to gain a reputation for themselves in such matters, they take one of two paths. If they are of a more timid disposition, they seek to be instructed by those experienced in that art, unaware at first of its evil nature. Or, if they are of a coarser nature, they run directly to the devil out of ambition or a desire for profit, and explicitly contract with him upon those terms. Philomaths. But it appears to me that these means, which you designate as the devil's school and rudiments, are lawful endeavors, and have been approved as such throughout all times and ages. In particular, this science of astrology, which is one of the distinct branches of mathematics. Epistemon. There are two aspects which the learned have observed from the very beginning within the science of the heavenly bodies, the planets, stars, and the like. The first is their course and ordinary motions, which, for that reason, is termed astronomia. This term is a compound of the Greek words for law and for stars, which is to say, the law of the stars. This art is indeed a legitimate branch of mathematics, and it is not only lawful but highly necessary and commendable. The second is termed astrologia, being compounded of the Greek words for stars and for speech, which is to say, the word and preaching of the stars. This latter discipline is divided into two parts. The first involves understanding the powers of medicinal herbs and the nature of sicknesses, as well as the progression of the seasons and the weather, all being governed by celestial influence. This part, dependent upon the former, though not strictly a branch of mathematics itself, is nevertheless not unlawful when utilized in moderation, even if it is not as necessary or commendable as astronomy. The second part involves placing such absolute trust in their influences as to prophesy which commonwealths shall flourish or decay, which person shall be fortunate or unfortunate, which faction shall triumph in any battle, which man shall obtain victory in a singular combat, in what manner and at what age men shall die, which horse shall win a race, and divers other incredible matters of this nature, subjects upon which Cardanus, Cornelius Agrippa, and various others have written extensively, with more curiosity than profit. From this last-mentioned root spring innumerable branches, such as divination by nativities, chiromancy, geomancy, hydromancy, arithmancy, physiognomy, and 1,000 others which were widely practiced and held in profound reverence by the Gentiles of antiquity. This final part of astrology of which I have spoken, serving as the root of these branches, was called by them pars fortunae. This particular pursuit is now utterly unlawful for Christians to trust in or practice, as it relies upon no foundation of natural reason, and it is precisely this part that I previously designated as the devil's school. Philomaths, and yet many among the learned hold the contrary opinion. Epistmen, I concede the point. However, I could provide my reasons to fortify and maintain my opinion, were it not that entering into such a disputation would draw me entirely away from the foundation of our discourse, in addition to squandering the entire day upon it. I shall offer but a single word in response to them, drawn from the Scriptures, which must serve as an infallible foundation for all true Christians. It is explicitly forbidden in the book of the prophet Jeremiah to believe or to hearken unto those who prophesy and foretell the future by the courses of the planets and stars. Chapter 5. Argument. To what extent the use of charms is lawful or unlawful. The description of the forms of circles and conjurations, and what causes the magicians themselves to grow weary thereof. Philomaths, well, you have spoken sufficiently upon that argument. But how do you now prove that these charms or unnatural practices are unlawful? For so many honest and jovial men and women have publicly practiced certain of them, that I believe if you were to accuse them all of witchcraft, you would assert more than you would be believed for. Epistmen, I see that had you paid close attention to the nature of the word by which I designated it, you would not have harbored this doubt, nor would you have misunderstood me to the extent that you have. For just as no one can be a scholar in a school without being subject to its master, so no one can study and put into practice, since study and knowledge alone are more perilous than they are offensive, and it is the practice alone that constitutes the enormity of the offense, the circles and the art of magic without committing a horrific defection from God. And yet, just as those who read and learn their rudiments are not fully subject to any schoolmaster if it does not please their parents to place them in the school thereafter, so it is with those who ignorantly attempt these practices, which I call the devil's rudiments, unaware that they are baits cast out by him to entrap such individuals as God will permit to fall into his hands. This kind of people, I maintain, are undoubtedly to be judged in the most favorable light, considering that they employ no invocation nor seek his assistance, at least to their knowledge, in these matters, and thus have never formally entered themselves into Satan's service. Yet, to speak truthfully for my own part, and I speak only for myself, I do not desire to ride so dangerously close to the edge. For, in my estimation, our enemy is overly cunning, and we are overly weak, barring the greater grace of God, to attempt such hazards wherein he endeavors to entrap us. Philomaths, you speak with good reason, in truth, for as the common proverb states, those who sup kale with the devil have need of long spoons. But now, I pray you, proceed in your description of this art of magic. Epistmen, from the moment they achieve this perfection in evil, by acquiring any knowledge, whether learned or unlearned, of this black art, they soon begin to grow weary of raising their master by means of conjured circles, as it is a task both difficult and perilous. Consequently, they proceed directly to establishing a contract with him, which specifically contains forms and effects. Philomaths, but I beg you, before you proceed any further, discourse with me somewhat regarding their circles and conjurations, and explain what should be the cause of their weariness of them. For it would seem that such a method should be less fearsome, even still, than direct haunting and keeping company with that foul and unclean spirit. Epistmen, I believe you take me for a witch myself, or at the very least, you would gladly swear yourself as an apprentice to that craft. Nevertheless, as best I may, I shall briefly satisfy your curiosity regarding that kind of conjuration, which is contained within such books as I have termed the Devil's School. There are 4 principal components: the persons of the conjurers, the action of the conjuration, the words and rites utilized to that effect, and the spirits that are conjured. You must first remember to lay the groundwork that I explained to you previously, namely, that there is no power inherent in the circles, nor in the holiness of the names of God blasphemously invoked, nor in whatsoever rites or ceremonies are performed at that time, that can either raise an infernal spirit or forcibly confine him within or without those circles. For it is he alone, the father of all lies, who, having initially prescribed that method of operation and feigning himself to be commanded and restrained by it, will be loath to transgress the bounds of those injunctions. He does this as much to make them glory in their perceived dominion over him, as I stated before, as to make himself so trusted in these lesser matters that he may possess the greater opportunity, thereafter, to deceive them in the end with a final, devastating trick, by which I mean the everlasting perdition of their soul and body. Laying this foundation, therefore, as I have said, these conjurations must involve a specific number of conjurers, whether few or many, always exceeding a single individual, according to the quality of the circle and the form of the apparition. 2 principal items cannot well be omitted from such an undertaking: holy water, by which the devil mocks the papists, and some offering of a living creature presented unto him. There are likewise certain seasons, days, and hours that they observe for this purpose. Once these elements are entirely ready and prepared, circles are drawn, triangular, quadrangular, round, double, or single, depending upon the form of the apparition they desire. However, to speak of the diverse forms of the circles, of the innumerable characters and crosses that lie within, without, and completely throughout them, of the various forms of apparitions with which that crafty spirit deludes them, and of all such particulars in that action, I leave that to the exceedingly many authors who have busied their minds in describing them, as such details are merely curiosities and altogether unprofitable. And I shall touch upon this matter only thus far. When the conjured spirit appears, which will not occur until after many circumstantial rituals, lengthy prayers, and much muttering and murmuring from the conjurers, akin to a papist priest hastily dispatching a hunting mass. As soon as he appears, I say, if they have missed a single iota of all their rites, or if so much as one of their feet slips outside the circle through terror of his fearful apparition, he pays himself, in his own hand at that very moment, that due debt which they owe him, and which he otherwise would have delayed longer in collecting. I mean to say, he carries them away with him, both body and soul. If this is not a justified cause to make them weary of these forms of conjuration, I leave it for you to judge, considering the tediousness of the labor, the precise observation of days and hours, as I have noted, the sheer terror of the apparition, and the immediate peril in which they place themselves by missing the slightest circumstance or superstitious rite they are bound to observe. And, on the other hand, the devil is only too glad to urge them toward a plain and direct dealing with him, as I stated before. Chapter 6. Argument. The devil's contract with the magicians. The division thereof into two parts. What constitutes the difference between God's miracles and the devil's? Philomaths. Indeed, there is cause enough, though it were better to abandon him entirely rather than to run more directly to him, if those with whom he dealt possessed any wisdom. But please proceed now, I pray you, to these matters, from the moment they once become adepts in this craft. Epistmen. From the time that they begin explicitly to contract with him, the substance of their contract consists of two elements. Forms and effects, as I had already begun to explain, had you not interrupted me. For although the contract is mutual, I speak first of that part wherein the devil obliges himself to them. By forms, I mean the shape or fashion in which he shall appear to them when they call upon him. And by effects, I understand the specific sorts of services in which he binds himself to be subject to them. The quality of these forms and effects is lesser or greater, depending upon the skill and art of the magician. Regarding these forms, to certain individuals of a more rudimentary caliber, he obligates himself to manifest upon their invocation, utilizing a specific appellation which he reveals unto them, whether in the likeness of a hound, a feline, an ape, or a comparable beast, or alternatively to answer by a voice exclusively. The resulting effects are to address such demands as concern the curing of maladies, their own specific domestic affairs, or such alternative mundane matters as they demand of him. Yet to the most inquisitive sort, regarding the forms he will obligate himself to inhabit a deceased corpse, and from therein to deliver such pronouncements concerning the outcomes of battles, of matters pertaining to the condition of commonwealths, and such comparable momentous inquiries. Indeed, to certain individuals he will remain a perpetual attendant, in the guise of a page. He shall permit himself to be conjured, for the duration of a specified number of years, whether within a tablet or a ring, or an analogous object, which they may conveniently carry upon their person. He grants them the authority to vend such artifacts to others, whereof certain items shall be more exorbitant, and others more affordable, contingent upon the mendacity or veracity of the spirit that is conjured therein. It is undeniable that in absolute truth all devils must be deceivers, yet in this manner they exploit the credulity of these wretches, who become their disciples, ensuring they are led to believe that during the descent of Lucifer, certain spirits fell into the air, some into the fire, some into the water, and some upon the land, within which elements they perpetually remain. Upon this foundation they assert that those who descended into the fire or into the air are more truthful than those who fell into the water or onto the land, which is nothing but absolute nonsense, and fabricated by the architect of all deceit. For they did not fall by virtue of physical weight, like a solid substance, to remain fixed in any singular location. Rather, the fundamental nature of their fall, consisting in spiritual quality, through their separation from the grace of God wherein they were originally forged, they persisted continuously thereafter, and shall remain so until the ultimate day of judgment, in wandering throughout the world, acting as the executioners of God, to perform such tasks as he assigns unto them. And whenever any among them are not occupied in such duties, return they must to their incarceration in hell, as is plainly evident in the miracle that Christ performed at Gennesaret, wherein at the final day they shall all be enclosed forever. And just as they deceive their disciples in this matter, so too do they, in impressing upon them the conviction that there are numerous princes dukes, and kings among their ranks, with each individual commanding fewer or more legions, and exercising dominion over diverse arts and various quadrants of the earth. For although I shall not deny that there exists a system of hierarchy among the angels in heaven, and consequently, that such order existed among them prior to their fall, nevertheless, whether they have retained that same structure since that time, or whether God would permit us to learn through damned devils such celestial mysteries of His, which He has chosen not to reveal to us either through Holy Scripture or the prophets, I believe no true Christian would ever entertain the thought. But to the contrary regarding all such mysteries, which He has secured with His seal of secrecy, it behooves us to remain contented with a humble ignorance, given that they are matters unnecessary for our ultimate salvation. But to return to the principal argument, just as these forms, wherein Satan obligates himself to the most eminent of the magicians, are remarkably peculiar, so too are the effects corresponding unto the same. For he shall obligate himself to instruct them in arts and sciences, which he may easily accomplish, being as profoundly learned a scoundrel as he is, to carry them tidings from any region of the world, which the inherent agility of a spirit may easily perform, to reveal to them the secrets of any individual, provided that they have been vocalized at least once. For the innermost thoughts none knows but God, except insofar as one might deduce from their countenance, as a being who is undoubtedly sufficiently learned in the study of physiognomy. Indeed, he shall enable his disciples to ingratiate themselves into the favor of princes, by prophesying unto them many momentous events, partly true, partly false. For if all declarations were false, he would forfeit his credibility entirely, yet they remain perpetually ambiguous, exactly as his ancient oracles were. And he shall furthermore empower them to delight princes, through magnificent banquets and exquisite dishes, transported in a remarkably brief interval from the farthest reaches of the world. For no man doubts that he is intrinsically a thief, and his preternatural agility, as I articulated previously, enables him to travel with such extraordinary speed. Similarly, he shall defend his disciples with grand armies of cavalry and infantry in mere appearance, alongside illusions of castles and forts, which are all nothing more than impressions rendered in the air, easily assembled by a spirit, given his own proximity to that ethereal substance. Just as in a similar manner he will instruct them in numerous sleight-of-hand tricks involving cards, dice, and such comparable items, to deceive the senses of men thereby, and such innumerable fraudulent practices, which are demonstrated by excessively many individuals in this current age. As those who are acquainted with that Italian known as Scoto who is yet living, can readily report. And yet all these phenomena are nothing but a delusion of the senses, and in no manner true in their fundamental substance, much like the fraudulent miracles executed by the magicians of King Pharaoh in their efforts at counterfeiting Moses. For that remains the paramount difference between the miracles of God and those of the devil. God is a supreme creator, and whatever he makes to appear in a miracle, it is genuinely so in tangible effect. As the rod of Moses being cast down, was without a doubt transformed into a natural serpent. Whereas the devil, acting as the imitator of God, counterfeiting that same feat through his magicians, made their wands to appear as such, exclusively to the outward senses of men, as was manifested in actual effect by their being devoured by the authentic serpent. For it is no cause for astonishment that the devil may delude our senses, since we observe through common evidence that simple illusionists can make 100 things appear to both our eyes and ears otherwise than they truly are. Now concerning the magician's portion of the contract, it is in a single word that very thing which I stated previously, the devil perpetually hunts for within all men. Philomaths, surely you have articulated much to me regarding this art, provided that everything you have stated is as truthful as it is astonishing. Epistmen, regarding the truth of these actions, it shall be easily confirmed, to anyone who pleases to take the necessary pains in the reading of diverse authentic histories, and the active inquiry into daily experiences. And as for the truth of their inherent possibility, that such things may exist, and in what precise manner, I trust one have alleged nothing unto which I have not adjoined such probable reasoning, as I now leave to your personal discretion, to weigh and carefully consider. One solitary point only have I omitted, concerning the specific form of the forging of this contract, which is either transcribed with the magician's own blood, or alternatively having been agreed upon, in specific terms his wicked schoolmaster, touches him in some bodily part, even though perchance no visible mark may remain, as it customarily does with all witches. Chapter 7. Argument. The reason why the art of magic is fundamentally unlawful. What specific punishment such practitioners merit, and who may precisely be accounted guilty of that heinous crime. Philomaths, you have caused this art to appear exceedingly monstrous and detestable. But what I pray of you shall be said to such individuals who maintain this art to be entirely lawful, regardless of how evil you have demonstrated it to be. Epistmen, I declare, they betray a taint of the fire themselves, or at the very least are little better, and yet I should be quite glad to hear their underlying reasons. Philomaths, there are two principally that I have ever heard utilized, aside from that which is founded upon the common proverb, that the necromancers actively command the devil, which you have already thoroughly refuted. The first is grounded upon an established and received custom, the other upon an authority, which certain men think to be entirely infallible. Upon the matter of custom, we observe that diverse Christian princes and magistrates who are severe punishers of witches will not only oversee magicians permitted to live within their sovereign dominions, but even sometimes take delight to see them demonstrate some of their practices. The alternative reason is that Moses, having been brought up, as it is expressly articulated in the Holy Scriptures, in all the diverse sciences of the Egyptians, whereof without a doubt this constituted one of the principal studies, and he notwithstanding his knowledge of this art, remaining pleasing unto God, as he demonstrably did, consequently implies that an art professed by so godly a man could not possibly be unlawful. Epistmen, as to the first of your proposed reasons, grounded upon established custom, I assert an evil custom can never be accepted as a good law, for the profound ignorance of the word among certain princes and magistrates, and the contempt for it among others, moves them to sin heavily against their office in that regard. As to the second reason, which appears to carry greater weight, if it were formulated as a syllogism, it would need to comprise numerous terms, and be riddled with fallacies, to speak in the language of logic. For first, that general proposition, affirming Moses to have been instructed in all the sciences of the Egyptians, should conclude that he was instructed in magic, I see no necessity. For we must understand that the Spirit of God there, speaking of sciences, refers to those that are lawful, for unless they are lawful, they are but abusiu called sciences, and are but ignorances indeed. For a painted man is not a man. Secondly, granting that he had been instructed in it, there is a profound difference between the knowledge and the practice of a thing, as I stated previously, for God knows all things, being always good, and from our sin and our infirmity proceeds our ignorance. Thirdly, granting that he had both studied and practiced the same, which is beyond monstrous to be believed by any Christian, yet we know well enough that before the Spirit of God ever began to call upon Moses, he had fled out of Egypt, being 40 years of age, for the slaughter of an Egyptian, and in the land of his father-in-law Jethro was first called at the burning bush, having remained there for another 40 years in exile. So that supposing he had been the most wicked man in the world before, he then became a changed and regenerate man, and very little of the old Moses remained within him. Abraham was an idolater in Ur of the Chaldeans, before he was called, and Paul, being called Saul, was a most fierce persecutor of the saints of God, until that name was changed. Philomaths, what punishment then do you believe these magicians and necromancers merit? Epistmen, the same no doubt that sorcerers and witches merit, and arguably so much greater, as their error proceeds from greater knowledge, and thus draws nearer to the sin against the Holy Ghost. And as I say of them, so I say equally of all such as consult, inquire of, entertain, and overlook them, which is demonstrated by the miserable ends of many who ask counsel of them. For the devil has never had better tidings to tell to anyone than he told to Saul. Neither is it lawful to use such unlawful instruments, were it ever for so noble a purpose. For that axiom in theology is most certain and infallible. One must never do evil that good may come from it. Chapter 8. Argument. Proven by the Scripture that such a phenomenon can exist, and the reasons refuted of all those who would dismiss it merely as an imagination and a melancholic humor. Philomaths, now since you have satisfied me now so fully, concerning magic or necromancy, I will pray you to do likewise regarding sorcery or witchcraft. Epistmen, that field is likewise exceedingly vast, and although it occupies the mouths and pens of many, yet few know the truth thereof, so well as they believe themselves, as I shall so shortly as I can, make you, God willing, as easily to perceive. Philomaths, but I pray you before you proceed further, allow me to interrupt you here with a brief digression, which is that many can scarcely believe that there is such a thing as witchcraft, whose reasons I will shortly allege to you, so that you may satisfy me as well in that, as you have done in the rest. For first, whereas the Scripture seems to prove witchcraft to exist by diverse examples, and especially by several of those same examples which you have alleged, it is thought by some that these passages speak of magicians and necromancers only and not of witches. As specifically, those wise men of Pharaoh, who counterfeited Moses' miracles, were magicians, they say, and not witches. As likewise that Pythoness with whom Saul consulted. And so was Simon Magus in the New Testament, as that very title implies. Secondly, where you would oppose the daily practice and confession of so many, that is thought likewise to be but the highly melancholic imaginations of simple raving creatures. Thirdly, if witches possess such power to bewitch people to death, as they claim they have, there would have been none left alive long since in the world, but they, at the least, no good or godly person of whatsoever estate, could have escaped their deviltry. Epistmen, your three reasons, as I understand, are grounded, the first of them negative upon the Scripture, the second affirmative upon medicine, and the third upon the definitive proof of experience. As to your first, it is most true indeed that all these wise men of Pharaoh were magicians by art. As likewise it is quite evident that the Pythoness with whom Saul consulted was of that same profession, and so was Simon Magus. But you neglected to speak of the law of God, wherein all magicians, diviners, enchanters, sorcerers, witches, and whatsoever entity of that kind that consults with the devil are plainly prohibited and equally threatened against. And besides that, she who possessed the spirit of Python, in the Acts, whose spirit was put to silence by the apostle, could be nothing other than a true sorcerer or witch. If you admit the vulgar distinction to be in a manner true, whereof I spoke at the beginning of our conference. For the spirit by which she procured such gain for her master was not subject to her raising or commanding, as she pleased to appoint, but spoke through her tongue, as well publicly as privately, whereby she seemed to draw nearer to the category of demoniacs or the possessed, had that union between them not been by her own consent, as was apparent by her not being tormented therewith, and by her procuring of such gain for her masters, as I have already stated. As to your second reason grounded upon medicine, in attributing their confessions or apprehensions to a natural melancholic humor. Anyone that cares medically to consider the natural humor of melancholy, in accordance with all the physicians that have ever written thereupon, they shall find that this will be far too short a cloak to cover their knavery with. For just as the melancholic humor is in itself black, heavy, and earthly, so are its symptoms, in any persons that are subjected thereunto, leanness, paleness, a desire for solitude, and if they reach the highest degree thereof, absolute folly and mania. Whereas by the contrary, a great number of those who have ever been convicted or have confessed to witchcraft, as may be presently seen by many who have at this time confessed. They are by the contrary, I say, some of them wealthy and worldly wise, some of them fat or corpulent in their bodies, and the vast majority of them entirely surrendered to the pleasures of the flesh, the continual haunting of company, and all manner of merriment, both lawful and unlawful, which are things directly contrary to the symptoms of melancholy, whereof I spoke, and further experience daily proves how loath they are to confess without torture, which bears witness to their guiltiness, where by the contrary, true melancholics never hesitate to betray themselves by their continual discourses, feeding thereby their humor with that which they perceive to be no crime. As for your third reason, it scarcely merits an answer. For if the devil their master were not bridled, as the Scriptures teach us, suppose there were no men nor women to be his instruments, he could find sufficient means without any help from others to ruin all mankind, whereunto he dedicates his entire study, and prowls about like a roaring lion, as Peter states to that effect. But the limits of his power were established before the foundations of the world were laid, which he does not possess the authority in the slightest iota to transgress. But besides all this, there is an exceedingly great certainty to prove that they exist, through the daily experience of the harm that they do, both to men, and whatsoever things men possess, to whom God will permit them to be the instruments so to trouble or visit, as in my discourse on that art, you shall hear clearly proven. Chapter 9. Argument. The etymology and signification of that word of sorcery. The initial entrance and apprenticeship of those who give themselves to that craft. Philomaths, proceed then, I pray you, and return to where you left off. Epistmen. This term of sorcery is a Latin word, which is derived from the casting of the lot, and therefore he who utilizes it is called sortiarius a sort. As for the term of witchcraft, it is nothing but a proper name bestowed in our language. The reason wherefore they were denominated sorciarage proceeded from their practices appearing to originate from lot or chance, such as the turning of the riddle, the discerning of the form of prayers, or such similar tokens, whether a diseased person would live or die, and in general that designation was given to them for utilizing such charms and superstitions as that craft instructs them. Many facets of their craft and practices are shared between the magicians and them, for they both serve one master, albeit in diverse fashions. And as I divided the necromancers into two classifications, learned and unlearned, so must I categorize them into another two, wealthy and of better standing, impoverished and of baser degree. These two degrees now of persons who practice this craft correspond to the passions within them, which, as I informed you previously, the devil utilized as means to entice them to his service. For such of them who are in great misery and poverty, he allures to follow him by promising unto them immense wealth and worldly commodity. Such as though wealthy, yet burn in a desperate desire for revenge, he allures them by promises to have their purpose satisfied to their heart's contentment. It is to be noted now that that ancient and crafty enemy of ours assails none, though afflicted with either of these two extremities, unless he first finds an entrance ready for him, either through the profound ignorance of the person he engages with, adjoined with an evil life, or otherwise through their carelessness and contempt of God. And finding them in utter despair, due to one of these two aforementioned causes of which I have spoken, he prepares the way by feeding them craftily in their humor, and filling them further and further with despair, until he finds the proper moment to reveal himself unto them, at which juncture, either upon their solitary walking in the fields, or otherwise lying pondering in their bed, but always without the company of any other, he either by a voice, or in the likeness of a man inquires of them, regarding what troubles them, and promises them a sudden and certain method of remedy, upon the condition on the other part, that they follow his counsel, and perform such things as he will require of them. Their minds being prepared beforehand, as I have already spoken, they easily agreed unto that demand of his, and subsequently establishes another tryst, where they may meet again, at which time, before he proceeds any further with them, he first persuades them to addict themselves to his service, which being easily obtained, he then reveals what he is unto them, makes them to renounce their God and baptism directly, and gives them his mark upon some secret place of their body, which remains sore and unhealed until his next meeting with them, and thereafter forever insensible, however it may be pinched or pricked by anyone, as is daily proven, to provide them a proof thereby, that just as in that action, he could hurt and heal them, so all their ill and well-doing thereafter must depend upon him. And besides that, the intolerable dolor that they feel in that place, where he has marked them, serves to awaken them, and not to let them rest until their next meeting again, fearing lest otherwise they might either forget him, being as new apprentices, and not well enough founded yet in that fiendish folly, or else remembering of that horrible promise they made him, at their last meeting, they might feel revulsion at the same and attempt to retract it. At their third meeting, he makes a pretense to be careful, to perform his promises, either by teaching them methods on how to get themselves revenged, if they be of that sort, or else by teaching them lessons on how through the most vile and unlawful means they may obtain gain and worldly commodity, if they be of the other sort. Chapter 10. Argument. The witches' actions divided into two parts. The actions proper to their own persons, their actions towards others, the form of their conventions, and adoring of their master. Philomaths, you have said now enough regarding their initiating in that order. It remains then that you discourse upon their practices, from the time they have passed as apprentices. For I would gladly hear what is possible for them to perform in very deed. Although they serve a common master with the necromancers, as I have before said, yet they serve him in another form. For as the means are diverse, which allure them to these unlawful arts of serving the devil, so by diverse ways they utilize their practices, answering to these means which first the devil used as instruments in them, though all tending to one end, to wit, the enlarging of Satan's tyranny, and the thwarting of the propagation of the kingdom of Christ, so far as lies within the possibility, either of the one or the other sort, or of the devil their master. For whereas the magicians, being allured by curiosity, in the greatest part of their practices, seek principally the satisfying of the same, and to win for themselves a popular honor and estimation. These witches, on the other part, being enticed either by the desire for revenge or for worldly riches, their entire practices are either to hurt men and their goods, or what they possess, for the satisfying of their cruel minds in the former, or else by the ruin in whatsoever sort, of any whom God will permit them to have power over, to satisfy their greedy desire in the latter point. Epistemon. In two parts their actions may be divided, the actions of their own persons, and the actions proceeding from them towards any other. And this division being well understood will easily resolve for you what is possible for them to do. For although everything that they confess is no lie upon their part, yet doubtlessly in my opinion, a part of it is not indeed, according as they take it to be. And in this I refer to the actions of their own persons. For as I said before, speaking of magic, that the devil eludes the senses of these scholars of his, in many things, so say I the like of these witches. Philomaths, then I pray you first to speak of that part of their own persons, and subsequently you may proceed next to their actions towards others. Epistemon, to the effect that they may perform such services of their false master, as he employs them in, the devil as God's ape, counterfeits in his servants this service and form of adoration, that God prescribed and made his servants to practice. For as the servants of God publicly are wont to convene for the serving of him, so makes he them in great numbers to convene, though publicly they dare not, for his service. As none convenes to the adoration and worshipping of God, except they be marked with his seal, the sacrament of baptism. So none serves Satan, and convenes to the adoring of him, that are not marked with that mark, whereof I already spoke. As the minister sent by God teaches plainly at the time of their public conventions how to serve him in spirit and truth, so that unclean spirit in his own person teaches his disciples at the time of their convening how to work all kinds of mischief, and craves an account of all their horrible and detestable proceedings past, for the advancement of his service. Indeed, that he may the more vividly counterfeit and scorn God, he oftentimes compels his slaves to convene in these very places, which are destined and ordained for the convening of the servants of God, by which I mean churches. But thus far, regarding what I have yet said, I not only consider it to be true in their opinions, but even so to be a reality. For the method that he utilized in counterfeiting God amongst the Gentiles compels me to think so. As God spoke by his oracles, did he not speak so by his? As God had as well bloody sacrifices as others without blood, did he not possess the like? As God had churches sanctified to his service, with altars, priests, sacrifices, ceremonies, and prayers, did he not have the like polluted for his service? As God gave responses by Urim and Thummim, did he not give his responses by the entrails of beasts, by the singing of fowls, and by their actions in the air? As God by visions, dreams, and ecstasies revealed what was to come, and what was his will unto his servants, did he not utilize similar means to forewarn his slaves of things to come? Indeed, even as God loved cleanliness, hated vice and impurity, and appointed punishments therefore, did he not utilize the like, though falsely I concede, and merely in eschewing the lesser inconvenience, to draw them toward a greater, yet did he not dissemble, I say, so far as to appoint his priests to keep their bodies clean and undefiled, before their asking responses of him? And did he not feign God to be a protector of every virtue, and a just revenger of the contrary? This reason then moves me, that as he is that same devil, and as crafty now as he was then, so will he not spare to act boldly in these actions that I have spoken of, concerning the witches' persons. But furthermore, witches oftentimes confess not only his convening in the church with them, but his occupying of the pulpit. Indeed, their form of adoration to be the kissing of his hinder parts, which though it seem ridiculous, yet may it likewise be true, seeing we read that in Calicut, he appearing in the form of a buck-goat, has publicly that shameful homage done unto him by every one of the people. So ambitious is he and greedy for honor, which procured his fall, that he will even imitate God in that part, where it is said that Moses could see but the hinder parts of God, due to the brightness of his glory. And yet that speech is spoken merely as Greek anthropopathy. Chapter 11. Argument. What are the possible ways whereby the witches may transport themselves to places far distant, and which are impossible and mere illusions of Satan, and the reasons thereof? Philomaths. But by what means do they say or think you it possible that they can come to these unlawful conventions? Epistmen. That is the matter which I esteem their senses to be deluded in, and although they lie not in confessing of it, because they genuinely believe it to be true, yet it is not so in substance or effect. For they say, that by diverse means they may convene, either for the adoring of their master, or for the putting into practice any service of his, committed unto their charge. One way is natural, which is natural riding, walking, or sailing, at whatever hour their master comes and notifies them. And this way may be easily believed. Another way is somewhat more strange, and yet is it possible to be true, which is by being carried by the force of the Spirit which is their conductor, either above the earth or above the sea swiftly, to the place where they are to meet. Which I am persuaded to be likewise possible, in respect that as Habakkuk was carried by the angel in that form, to the den where Daniel lay, so think I, the devil will be ready to imitate God, as well in that as in other things, which is much more possible for him to do, being a spirit, than for a mighty wind, being but a natural meteor, to transport from one place to another a solid body, as is commonly and daily seen in practice. But in this violent form they cannot be carried, except for short distances, agreeing with the space that they may retain their breath. For if it were longer, their breath could not remain unextinguished, their bodies being carried in such a violent and forcible manner, as by example. If one falls off a small height, his life is but in peril according to the hard or soft alighting. But if one falls from a high and steep rock, his breath will be forcibly banished from the body before he can reach the earth, as is often seen by experience. And in this transporting they say themselves that they are invisible to any other, except amongst themselves, which may also be possible in my opinion. For if the devil may form whatever kind of impressions he pleases in the air, As I have said before, speaking of magic, why may he not far more easily thicken and obscure so the air that is next about them by contracting it tightly together, that the beams of any other man's eyes cannot pierce through the same to see them? But the third way of their coming to their conventions is that wherein I think them deluded. For some of them state that being transformed into the likeness of a little beast or fowl, they will come and pierce through whatsoever house or church, though all ordinary passages be closed, by whatsoever opening the air may enter in at. And some state that their bodies lying still as in an ecstasy, their spirits will be ravished out of their bodies and carried to such places. And for verifying thereof, they will give evident tokens, as well by witnesses that have seen their body lying senseless in the meantime, as by naming persons with whom they met, and giving tokens of what purpose was discussed amongst them, whom otherwise they could not have known. For this form of journeying they affirm to use most, when they are transported from one country to another. Philomaths, surely I long to hear your own opinion of this. For they are like old wives' tales about the fire. The reasons that move me to think that these are mere illusions are these. First, for them that are transformed into the likeness of beasts or fowls, that they can enter through so narrow passages, although I may easily believe that the devil could by his workmanship upon the air, make them appear to be in such forms, either to themselves or to others. Yet how he can contract a solid body within so little room, I think it is directly contrary to itself, for to be made so little and yet not diminished, to be so tightly drawn together, and yet feel no pain, I think it is so contrary to the quality of a natural body, and so like to the little transubstantiated God in the Papist's Mass, that I can never believe it. So to have a quantity is so proper to a solid body, that as all philosophers conclude, it cannot be any more without one, than a spirit can have one. For when Peter came out of the prison, and the doors all locked, it was not by any contracting of his body into so little room, but by the giving place of the door, though unespied by the jailers. And yet is there no comparison, when this is done, betwixt the power of God and of the devil. As to their form of ecstasy and spiritual transporting, it is certain the soul's going out of the body is the only definition of natural death. And for those who are once dead, God forbid we should think that it should lie in the power of all the devils in hell to restore them to their life again. Although he can put his own spirit into a dead body, which the necromancers commonly practice, as you have heard. For that is the office properly belonging to God, and besides that, the soul once parting from the body cannot wander any longer in the world, but to its own resting place must it go immediately, abiding the conjunction of the body again at the latter day. And what Christ or the prophets did miraculously in this case, it cannot in any Christian man's opinion be made common with the devil. Regarding any tokens they offer to prove this, it is entirely within the power of the devil's craft to persuade them through such means. As he is a spirit, might he not so ravish their thoughts and dull their senses that, while their bodies lie as if dead, he may present to their spirits, as though in a dream, and exactly as the poets write of Morpheus, such forms of persons, places, and other circumstances as he pleases to delude them with? Furthermore, that he may deceive them with greater efficacy, might he not at that exact instant, through his fellow fallen angels, delude other persons in that identical fashion, those with whom he makes them believe they convened, so that all their reports and tokens, even when examined separately, may perfectly agree with one another. And whatever actions, whether in harming men or beasts, or whatever other deeds they falsely imagine themselves to have committed at that time, may by himself or his companions be genuinely executed at that very moment. Thus, if they were to offer as a token of their ravishment the death of such a person within so short a time thereafter, whom they believed to have poisoned or bewitched at that instant, might he not at that same hour have smitten that very person, by the permission of God, to further deceive them and to compel others to believe them? Surely, this is the most probable explanation, and the one most in accordance with reason, that my judgment can discern regarding this and any other unnatural elements of their confessions. By these means shall we sail securely between Charybdis and Scylla, avoiding the absolute disbelief in them on the one hand, lest that draw us into the error of denying that there are witches, and on the other hand, in believing it, ensuring we eschew falling into innumerable absurdities that are monstrously contrary to both divine theology and human philosophy. Chapter 12. Argument. Witches' actions towards others. Why there are more women of that craft than men. What things are possible for them to effectuate by the power of their master. The reasons thereof. What is the surest remedy for the harms done by them? Philomaths. In truth, your opinion on this matter seems to carry the utmost reason, and you have now concluded your explanation of the actions belonging properly to their own persons. Proceed now to their actions directed towards others. Epistemon. In their actions directed towards others, 3 elements ought to be considered. First, the manner of their consulting thereupon. Next, their role as instruments. And finally, their master's part, who puts the same into execution. As to their consultations thereupon, they conduct them most frequently in the churches, where they convene for adoration. At that time, their master inquires of them what they desire to achieve. Every one of them proposes unto him what wicked deed they would have done, whether for the obtaining of riches, or for exacting revenge upon any against whom they harbor malice. He, granting their demand, as he undoubtedly will do willingly, since it is to commit evil, teaches them the means by which they may accomplish the same. As for the petty, trifling matters with which women concern themselves, he causes them to dismember dead corpses and to render them into powders, mixing amongst them such other ingredients as he bestows upon them. Philomaths. But before you proceed further, permit me, I pray you, to interrupt you with a single inquiry, which you have brought to my memory by speaking of women. What can be the cause that there are 20 women given to that craft for every one man? Epistemon. The reason is evident, for as that sex is frilier than man, so is it more easily entrapped in these gross snares of the devil, as was exceedingly well proven to be true by the serpent's deceiving of Eve at the beginning, which has made him all the more familiar with that sex ever since. Philomaths. Return now to where you left off. Epistemon. To certain others on these occasions, he teaches how to fashion effigies of wax or clay. By the roasting of these figures, the persons whose names they bear may be continually melted or dried away through unceasing sickness. To some, he provides such stones or powders as will serve to cure or to inflict diseases. And to others, he imparts the knowledge of bizarre poisons which physicians do not understand. For he is far more cunning than man in his comprehension of all the occult properties of nature. It is not that any of these methods which he teaches them, excepting the poisons which are composed of natural substances, possess any inherent power by themselves to assist in the deeds for which they are employed, but rather that he acts merely as God's ape, as well in this as in all other matters. Just as God, through his sacraments, which are earthly in themselves, works a heavenly effect without any inherent cooperation within the elements. And just as Christ, through clay and spittle wrought together, opened the eyes of the blind man, even supposing there was no virtue in the substance he outwardly applied, so too will the devil employ his outward means to serve as illusions of his workings, which possess no actual cooperation in his deeds, regardless of how profoundly the ignorant may be deceived to the contrary. And as to the effects of these two aforementioned parts, namely, the consultations and the outward means, they are so astonishing that I dare not allege any of them without affixing a sufficient explanation regarding the possibility thereof. Let us leave aside all the petty trifles common among wives, and speak instead of the principal tenets of their craft. As for those common trifles, they can perform them capably enough by themselves without resorting to profound transformation. These principal points, I assert, are as follows. They can compel men or women to love or hate one another, which is entirely possible for the devil to effectuate. Seeing that he is a subtle spirit, he knows perfectly well how to manipulate the corrupted affections of those whom God permits him to afflict. They can transfer the sickness of one individual onto another, an act which is likewise entirely within his power. For since, by God's permission, he laid a grievous affliction upon Job, there is no reason he might not far more easily inflict the same upon any other. As a seasoned practitioner, he knows well enough which humor dominates most within any of us, and as a spirit, he can subtly awaken it, rendering it diseased or causing it to abound, exactly as he deems fitting to trouble us, whenever God so permits him. As for the removal of such ailments, he will undoubtedly be glad to relieve individuals of their present pain, provided he believes that by these means he may persuade them to become ensnared in his everlasting traps and fetters. They can bewitch and take the lives of men or women by the roasting of effigies, as I discussed previously, which is likewise highly possible for their master to perform. For although, as I stated before, that instrument of wax possesses no inherent virtue to accomplish the deed, might he not, in exact proportion to the rate at which his conjured slaves melt that wax at the fire, subtly, as a spirit, weaken and scatter the life spirits of the patient? In doing so, he might cause the victim, on the one hand, to sweat out the humors of his body through sheer faintness, and on the other hand, due to the failure of those spirits which facilitate his digestion, he may so debilitate the victim's stomach that his radical humor continually sweats out. With no fresh nourishment introduced to take its place because of this lack of digestion, the victim shall ultimately waste away, just as his effigy does at the fire. That knavish and cunning craftsman, by afflicting him only at specific intervals, establishes a proportion so exact between the working of the effigy and the deterioration of the man, that both shall conclude at precisely the same time. They can raise storms and tempests in the air, whether upon the sea or the land, though not universally, but only within such specific locations and prescribed boundaries as God will permit them to disturb. This phenomenon is likewise very easily distinguished from any natural tempests, which are atmospheric anomalies, on account of their sudden and violent inception, together with their exceedingly brief duration. And this is likewise entirely possible for their master to accomplish, possessing as he does such an affinity with the air by virtue of being a spirit, and wielding such power over its formation and movement, as you have already heard me declare. Indeed, in the Scriptures, the title of the Prince of the Air is bestowed upon him. They are capable of driving individuals to frenzy or mania, an outcome that is likewise well within their master's capability to effect, given that these are merely natural ailments. And so, He may inflict afflictions of this nature, just as readily as any others. They can compel spirits either to follow and torment individuals, or to haunt specific dwellings. And they frequently terrify the inhabitants. Such occurrences have been known to be perpetrated by our witches in the present day. Likewise, they can cause individuals to be possessed by spirits, thereby becoming veritable demoniacs. And this latter condition is equally possible for the devil, their master, to induce, since he may easily dispatch his own angels to afflict, in whatever form he pleases, anyone whom God will permit him to exploit in such a manner. Philomaths. But will God permit these wicked instruments, through the power of the devil, their master, to torment by any of these means those who believe in him? Epistemon. Undoubtedly, for there are three categories of individuals whom God will permit to be thus tempted or troubled: the wicked, for their horrific sins, in order to punish them in equal measure; the godly, who are slumbering in any grievous sins, infirmities, or weakness of faith, to awaken them more swiftly through such an extraordinary manner; and even some of the most righteous, so that their patience may be tested before the world, just as Job's was. For why may God not employ any form of extraordinary punishment when it pleases him, just as he utilizes the ordinary rods of sickness or other adversities? Philomaths. Who, then, may consider themselves free from these devilish practices? Epistemon. No man ought to presume so far as to guarantee any impunity for himself. For God has, before all beginnings, foreordained the particular kinds of plagues as well as the benefits for every man, with which he ordains them to be visited in their proper time. And yet we ought not to be any more terrified on that account of anything that the devil and his wicked instruments can perpetrate against us. For we daily wage war against the devil in 100 other ways. And therefore, just as a valiant captain is no longer afraid once engaged in combat, nor deterred from his objective by the thunderous report of a cannon or the sharp crack of a pistol, supposing he is uncertain of what fate may befall him, even so ought we boldly to advance in our battle against the devil without experiencing any greater terror for these, his most unusual weapons, than for the ordinary ones of which we encounter daily proof. Philomaths. Is it not lawful, then, to cure the disease inflicted by that craft through the assistance of another witch? Epistemon. It is in no way lawful. For I provided you with the reasoning for this in that axiom of theology, which constituted the final words I spoke concerning magic. Philomaths. How, then, may these diseases be lawfully cured? Epistemon. Only through earnest prayer to God, by the amendment of their lives, and by the relentless pursuit, each according to his calling, of these instruments of Satan, whose punishment by death shall serve as a salutary sacrifice for the patient. And this is not merely the lawful path, but likewise the most secure. For the devil can never be cast out by the devil's own means, as Christ affirms. Furthermore, when such a cure is employed, it may well suffice for a brief duration, but ultimately, it will undoubtedly lead to the utter perdition of the patient, in both body and soul. Chapter 13. Argument. What sort of individuals are least or most susceptible to sustaining harm through witchcraft? What power they possess to injure the magistrate, and under what circumstances they retain any authority while in prison, and to what purpose the devil may or will manifest to them therein. For what reasons the devil appears in various shapes to different individuals among them at any given time. Philomaths. But who would dare to take it upon himself to punish them, if no man can be certain of remaining free from their unnatural invasions. Epistemon. We ought not to refrain from virtue simply because the path by which we ascend to it is narrow and perilous. Furthermore, just as there is no class of persons more susceptible to suffering harm from them than those of infirm and weak faith, which serves as the greatest buckler against such invasions, they similarly possess so little power over anyone as they do over those who zealously and resolutely pursue them, without withholding effort out of any worldly consideration. Philomaths. Then they are akin to the plague, which most severely strikes those who flee from it the furthest, and who harbor the deepest apprehension of its peril. Epistemon. It is precisely thus with them, for they are entirely incapable of administering any false cure upon a patient, unless that patient first believes in their power and thereby risks the loss of his own soul. Nor can they have less power to harm anyone than those who hold their actions in the utmost contempt, provided such defiance stems from faith and not from any vain arrogance within themselves. Philomaths. But what is the extent of their power against the magistrate? Epistemon. It is lesser or greater, commensurate with how he deals with them. For if he demonstrates slothfulness towards them, God is wholly capable of rendering them instruments to awaken and punish his negligence. But if he behaves to the contrary, he will, in accordance with the just law of God and the permissible law of all nations, be diligent in examining and punishing them. God will not permit their master to trouble or hinder so righteous an endeavor. Philomaths. But once they are apprehended and placed in confinement, do they retain any further power in their craft? Epistemon. That depends entirely upon the nature of their detention. If they are merely apprehended and detained by a private citizen, on account of other private matters, their power, undoubtedly either to escape or to inflict harm, is no less than it ever was previously. If, on the other hand, their apprehension and detention are carried out by the lawful magistrate, upon the just considerations of their guilt in that craft, their power is then no greater than it was before they ever associated with their master. For where God justly begins to strike through his lawful lieutenants, it is not within the devil's power to defraud or deprive him of the office or the efficacy of his powerful and avenging scepter. Philomaths. But will their master never come to visit them, once they have been apprehended and placed in confinement? Epistemon. That depends upon the state in which these miserable wretches find themselves. For if they remain obstinate in their continuous denials, he will not hesitate, whenever he finds an opportunity to commune with them, to act accordingly. If he discovers them experiencing any comfort, he will increasingly fill them with the vain hope of some manner of relief. Or, conversely, if he finds them in deep despair, he will utilize all means to amplify that anguish and persuade them, through some extraordinary method, to end their own lives, an act which they very commonly commit. However, if they are penitent and confess, God will not permit him to torment them any further with his presence and allurements. Philomaths. It is clearly not beneficial to rely upon his counsel, I perceive. But I would earnestly like to know, when he appears to them in prison, what forms does he then assume? Epistemon. Diverse forms, exactly as he is accustomed to doing on other occasions with them. For, as I informed you while speaking of magic, he ordinarily appears to those types of practitioners in a specific form, according to whatever they have mutually agreed upon amongst themselves. Alternatively, if they are merely apprentices, he manifests according to the quality of their circles or conjurations. Yet, to these wretched creatures, he appears however he pleases, and in whatever guise he deems most fitting for their temperaments. For even at their public conventions, he appears to different individuals among them in diverse forms, as we have discovered through the variations in their confessions regarding that matter. By deluding them with vain impressions in the air, he makes himself appear more terrifying to the cruder sort, so that they may thereby be moved to fear and revere him all the more. And, conversely, he manifests as less monstrous and uncouth to the more astute sort, lest they might otherwise be alarmed and recoil at his ugliness. Philomaths, how can he then be felt? They confess they have felt him, but how is this possible if his body is composed solely of air? Epistmen, I hear little of that among their confessions. Nevertheless, he may render himself palpable either by assuming a dead body and utilizing its vessel, or by deceiving their sense of touch as well as their sight. This is not impossible for him to achieve, given that all our senses, being inherently weak, are frequently deceived even by ordinary illnesses. Philomaths, but I would inquire one word further regarding his appearing to them in prison, which is this. May anyone else who happens to be present at that time in the prison see him as clearly as they do? Epistmen, sometimes they will and sometimes they will not, as it pleases God. Chapter 14. Argument. Two forms of the devil's visible conversing on the earth, alongside the reasons wherefore the first of them was most common during the time of papistry, and the other since that time. Those who deny the power of the devil simultaneously deny the power of God, and are thus guilty of the error of the Sadducees. Philomaths, does the devil, then, possess the power to appear to anyone other than those who are his sworn disciples? This is especially questionable since all oracles and similar kinds of illusions were removed and abolished by the coming of Christ. Epistmen, although it is indeed true that the brightness of the gospel at his coming dispelled the clouds of all these gross errors in Gentilism, yet, daily experience teaches us that these deceiving spirits have not ceased to appear occasionally since that time. Indeed, this distinction must be observed regarding the forms of Satan's visible conversing in the world. For of the two different forms thereof, the first, due to the spreading of the gospel and the conquest of the white horse in the 6th chapter of Revelation, is significantly hindered and has thereby become much rarer. This entails his appearing to any Christians, troubling them outwardly, or possessing them by constraint. The second of these forms has become more common and frequently utilized since then. I refer to their unlawful arts, which have been the entire focus of our discourse. We find this to be true through experience in this isle. For, as we know, more ghosts and spirits were seen than the tongue can tell during the time of blind papistry in these countries, whereas now, on the contrary, a man shall scarcely hear of such things even once in his entire lifetime. And yet, these unlawful arts were far rarer at that time. Furthermore, they were never so frequently heard of, nor so rife as they are at present. Philomaths, what might be the cause of that? Epistmen, the diverse nature of our sins procures from the justice of God diverse sorts of punishments corresponding thereunto. And therefore, just as in the time of papistry, when our fathers erred grossly and through ignorance, that mist of errors overshadowed the devil, allowing him to walk more familiarly among them, and, as it were, through infantile and frightful terrors, he mocked and accused their infantile errors. On the contrary, since we are now sound in religion yet rebel against our profession in our lives, God justly, through that sin of rebellion, as Samuel terms it, accuses our lives for fighting so willfully against our own profession. Philomaths, I mention this since you have now begun to speak of the appearing of spirits. I would be glad to hear your opinion on that matter. For many deny that any such spirits can appear in these days, as I have stated. Epistemon. Undoubtedly, whosoever denies the power of the devil would likewise deny the power of God, if they could do so without shame. For since the devil is the absolute and contrary opposite to God, there can be no better way to know God than by the contrary, such as by using the power of the one, though merely a creature, to admire the power of the great Creator. We may observe this by using the falsehood of the one to consider the truth of the other, and by the injustice of the one to consider the justice of the other, and by the cruelty of the one to consider the mercifulness of the other, and so forth throughout all the remainder of the essence of God and the qualities of the devil. But I fear, indeed, that there are far too many Sadducees in this world who deny all kinds of spirits. To convict them of their error, there is sufficient cause, even if there were no other reason, for God to permit spirits occasionally to manifest visibly. Chapter 15. The description of all these kinds of spirits that trouble men or women. The conclusion of the entire dialogue. Argument. The division of spirits into 4 principal kinds. The description of the first kind of them, called spectra and vimbrae mortuorum. What is the best way to be free of their trouble? Philomaths. I pray you, then, proceed in telling what you consider to be fabulous, or what may be believed in that regard. Epistemon. That manner of the devils conversing on the earth may be divided into 4 distinct kinds, whereby he frightens and troubles the bodies of men. For concerning the abusing of the soul I have spoken already. The first is when spirits trouble certain houses or solitary places. The second is when spirits attach themselves to specific persons and trouble them at various hours. The third is when they enter within them and possess them. The fourth consists of that kind of spirits which are vulgarly called the fairy. Concerning the 3 former kinds, you have heard already how they may be artificially compelled by witchcraft to trouble people. Now it remains to speak of their natural coming, as it were, which is not raised by witchcraft. But, generally, I must forewarn you of one thing before I embark upon this subject. That is, although in my discoursing of them I divide them into diverse kinds, you must nevertheless take note of my phrasing in that regard. For undoubtedly they are, in effect, but one single kind of spirits, who do this to further abuse mankind. They take upon themselves these sundry shapes and utilize diverse forms of outward actions, as if some were by nature superior to others. Now I return to my purpose. Regarding the first kind of these spirits, they were called by the ancients by diverse names, according to the nature of their actions. Consider if they were spirits that haunted certain houses by appearing in diverse and horrible forms, and making a great din. They were called lemurs or spectra. If they appeared in the likeness of any deceased individual to some of his friends, they were called vimbrae mortuorum. And thus they received innumerable titles according to their actions, as I have stated already. As we see by experience, they have been given many titles in our own language in a similar manner. Of the appearing of these spirits, we are certified by the Scriptures, wherein the prophet Isaiah in the 13th and 34th chapters threatens the destruction of Babel and Edom. He declares that they shall not only be ruined, but shall become so great a solitude that they shall serve as the habitation of owls, and of Zim and Iim, which are the proper Hebrew names for these spirits. The reason why they haunt solitary places is so that they may more effectively frighten and shake the faith of those who haunt such places alone. For our nature is such that, when in company, we are not as easily moved to any such kind of fear as we are when solitary. The devil, knowing this well enough, will therefore not assail us except when we are vulnerable. Furthermore, God will not permit him to dishonor the societies and companies of Christians to such a degree as to walk visibly among them during public times and in public places. On the other hand, when he troubles certain inhabited houses, it is a sure token either of gross ignorance or of some severe and slanderous sins among the inhabitants thereof. Such transgressions are what God punishes by means of that extraordinary rod. Philomaths, but by what way or passage can these spirits enter into these houses? Considering it is alleged that they will enter even when the door and window are securely fastened. Epistmen, they shall select the passage for their entrance, in accordance with the form they possess at that particular moment. For if they have assumed a deceased corpse, within which they ensconce themselves, they can easily open any door or window without creating a disturbance, and enter therein. And if they enter merely as a spirit, any aperture through which the air may pass is sufficiently expansive to serve as an entrance for them. For as I have previously stated, a spirit can occupy no physical volume. Philomaths, and will God, then, permit these malevolent spirits to disturb the repose of a dead body before the resurrection thereof? Or if he should will it so, I should think it would apply exclusively to the reprobate. Epistmen, in what manner is the repose of a dead body disturbed any further, when the devil removes it from the grave to serve his purposes for a time, than when witches exhume and dismember it, or when swine root up the graves? The rest of those that the Scripture speaks of is not defined by a localized, continuous remaining in a single place, but rather by their respite from the travails and miseries of this world, pending their ultimate reunification with the soul at that time to receive full glory in both. And that the devil may utilize the agency of the bodies of the faithful in these instances, just as readily as those of the unfaithful, presents no impropriety, for his inhabiting of their bodies after they are dead can in no way defile them, in respect of the soul's absence, and regarding any dishonor it might bring upon them. By what logic could it be considered more severe than the hanging, beheading, or myriad of other shameful deaths that virtuous men are compelled to endure? For there is nothing in the bodies of the faithful more worthy of honor or freer from natural corruption than in those of the unfaithful, until such time as they are purged and glorified in the final days, as is daily evidenced by the vile diseases and corruptions to which the bodies of the faithful are subjected, as you shall see clearly demonstrated when I speak of the possessed and the demoniacs. Philomaths, yet there are various individuals who affirm they have frequented such places, where these spirits are alleged to reside, and could never hear nor perceive anything. Epistmen, I readily believe it, for that matter is exclusively reserved to the secret knowledge of God, regarding whom he will permit to witness such phenomena, and whom not. Philomaths, but where these spirits haunt and distress any houses, what is the most efficacious method to banish them? Epistmen, the remedy for such afflictions may be procured exclusively through two means. The first is fervent prayer to God, offered both by the persons who are tormented by them and by the congregation to which they belong. The second is the spiritual purification of themselves, through the amendment of their lives, from such sins as have invited that extraordinary plague. Philomaths, and what, then, is the intent of these kinds of spirits when they manifest themselves in the apparition of a person newly deceased or on the verge of death to his friends. Epistemon. When they manifest upon such occasions, they are referred to as wraiths in our parlance. Among the heathens, the devil employed this tactic extensively, to deceive them into believing that it was a benevolent spirit manifesting to them then, either to forewarn them of their friend's demise, or else to disclose to them the testament of the deceased, or what the manner of his slaughter was, as is documented in the Book of Prodigious Histories. And in this manner he effortlessly deceived the heathens, because they were ignorant of God. And it is to this very same end that he presently appears in such a guise to certain ignorant Christians. For he dares not so delude anyone who possesses the knowledge of that. Neither can the spirit of the deceased return to his friend, nor yet an angel adopt such forms. Philomaths. And are not our werewolves also a classification of these spirits, which haunt and plague certain houses or dwelling places? Epistemon. There has, indeed, been an ancient belief regarding such matters, for by the Greeks they were called wolf-men, which signifies men-wolves. But to express my opinion on this simply, if any such phenomenon has truly existed, I consider it to have proceeded merely from a natural superabundance of melancholy, which, as we read, has caused some individuals to believe themselves to be pitchers, and others to be horses, and still others to be some species of beast or another. Thus, I surmise that it has so corrupted the imagination and memory of certain individuals that, per lucida intervalla, it has so thoroughly possessed their minds, that they have believed themselves to be actual wolves during these times. And consequently, they have imitated their actions by crawling upon their hands and feet, attempting to devour women and children, fighting and snapping with all the dogs of the town, and engaging in similar brutish behaviors, and thereby becoming beasts through a powerful delusion, much as Nebuchadnezzar did for 7 years. But as for their possessing and concealing their tough and scaly hides, I consider that detail to be merely appended, by unreliable rumor, the author of all lies. Chapter 16. Argument. The description of the subsequent 2 classifications of spirits, of which the former outwardly pursues, and the latter inwardly possesses, the persons whom they afflict. That, since all prophecies and visions have now ceased, all spirits that manifest in these forms are inherently malevolent. Philomaths. Proceed forward now to the remainder of these classifications of spirits. Epistemon. As to the next 2 kinds, that is, either those that outwardly afflict and pursue certain persons, or alternatively, inwardly possess them, I shall conjoin them into a single discourse, because the causes are similar in the individuals whom they are permitted to trouble, as are the methodologies whereby they may be remedied and cured. Philomaths. What classification of persons is typically subjected to such afflictions? Epistemon. 2 distinct kinds in particular. Either those who, being guilty of grievous offenses, God punishes through that horrific variety of scourge, or else, being individuals of perhaps the most virtuous nature, that you shall find throughout the surrounding country, God permits them to be afflicted in such a manner, for the trial of their patience, and the awakening of their zeal, for admonishing the beholders not to place excessive trust in themselves, since they are fashioned from no superior material, and are perhaps stained by no lesser sins, exactly as Christ stated, speaking of those upon whom the tower in Siloam fell. And similarly for providing the spectators a reason to praise God, recognizing that they, meriting no better fate, are nevertheless spared from being chastised in that dreadful manner. Philomaths. These are profound justifications on the part of God, which evidently move him to permit the devil to afflict such individuals. But since the devil continually harbors a contrary motive in all the actions for which God employs him, what, I pray you, is the ultimate objective and target he aims for in this endeavor? Epistemon. It is to achieve one of two outcomes thereby, if he is able. The first is the destruction of their life, by luring them into such perilous environments at the very time he either pursues or possesses them, which may precipitate that demise. And similarly, to the extent that God will permit him, by tormenting them to debilitate their physical bodies, and cast them into incurable diseases. The second objective that he strives to achieve by afflicting them is the ruin of their soul, by enticing them to distrust and blaspheme God. He attempts this either through the intolerable nature of their torments, as he endeavored to accomplish with Job, or alternatively, by promising them that he will cease his affliction, in case they agree to do so, a fact well known through contemporary experience by the confession of a youth who was so tormented. Philomaths. Since you have now spoken of both of these classifications of spirits, comprehending them as a singular subject, I must now regress and inquire concerning specific questions about each of these classifications individually. And firstly, regarding those that persistently follow certain individuals, you are aware that there are two categories of them. One category that harasses and torments the individuals whom they haunt. Another category that proves serviceable to them in all manner of their necessities, and never fails to forewarn them of any sudden peril they may encounter. Consequently, in this instance, I wish to understand whether both of these classifications consist solely of wicked and damned spirits, or, conversely, if the latter category is instead comprised of angels, as their actions would suggest, dispatched by God to assist those whom he particularly favors. For it is recorded within the Scriptures that God sends legions of angels to guard and watch over his elect. Epistemon. I know full well from whence the error you allege has originated, for it was the ignorant Gentiles who served as its fountainhead. Because they knew not God, they forged within their own imaginations the notion that every man is constantly accompanied by two spirits, the first of which they called a genius bonus, and the second a genius malus. The Greeks referred to them as good spirits and evil spirits. The former, they claimed, persuaded a man toward all the good he accomplished. The latter enticed him toward all the evil. However, praised be God, we who are Christians, and who do not walk among the Sumerian conjectures of mankind, know adequately well that it is exclusively the good Spirit of God, who is the fountain of all goodness, that persuades us to the contemplation or execution of any good deed, and that it is our corrupted flesh and Satan that entice us to the contrary. And yet the devil, in order to confirm in the minds of ignorant Christians that error which was first maintained among the Gentiles, would occasionally, under the guise of the first kind of spirits of which I speak, appear during times of papistry and blindness. He would haunt various houses without causing any harm. Instead, he would perform, as it were, necessary chores throughout the household. This spirit they called a brownie in our language, who appeared in the guise of a rugged man. Indeed, some were so blinded as to believe that their household was all the more fortunate, or sonsier as they termed it, because such spirits frequented the premises. Philomaths. But since the devil's intention in all of his actions is invariably to do evil, what wickedness existed in that mode of conduct, given that their outward actions were benevolent? Epistemon. Was it not sufficiently evil to deceive the simple and ignorant, causing them to mistake him for an angel of light, and thus to regard God's enemy as their own particular friend? Whereas, to the contrary, all of us who are Christians ought assuredly to know that since the coming of Christ in the flesh, and the establishment of his church by the apostles, all miracles, visions, prophecies, and appearances of angels or good spirits have ceased. These served solely for the initial sowing of the faith and the planting of the church. Now that the church has been established, and the white horse of which I spoke previously having made its conquest, the law and the prophets are deemed sufficient to serve us, or otherwise render us inexcusable, as Christ states in his parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Chapter 17. Argument. The description of a particular variety of those following spirits, known as incubi and succubi. Furthermore, the rationale as to why these types of spirits predominantly haunt the northern and barbarous regions of the world. Philomaths. The subsequent question I wish to pose likewise concerns the first of these two categories of spirits that you have coupled together. It is this: you are aware of how it is commonly written and reported that, among the remaining types of spirits that attach themselves to certain individuals, there is one far more monstrous than all the rest, owing to the allegation that they engage in carnal relations with those whom they torment and haunt. Therefore, I would seek your opinion on two matters regarding this subject. First, whether such a phenomenon is even possible, and secondly, if it is indeed possible, whether or not there exists a distinction of sexes among these spirits. Epistemon. That abominable manner in which the devil abuses men or women was known in antiquity as incubi and succubi, varying according to the sex of those with whom they consorted. This profound violation might conceivably be executed through two distinct methods. The first occurs when the devil, acting solely as a spirit, extracts the seed from a deceased body and violates his victims in that manner. In such cases, they do not clearly perceive any physical shape nor feel anything other than that which he conveys into that specific region. This is akin to what we read concerning a monastery of nuns who were burned at the stake for having been abused in precisely this fashion. The second method is when he commandeers a deceased body and thus, visibly, and, as it appears to the victims naturally, engages in carnal relations with them as a living man would. However, it must be noted that, regardless of the method he employs, that seed feels intolerably cold to the person being abused. For if he were to extract the essence from a living person, it cannot be transported so swiftly without losing both its strength and heat along the way. Furthermore, it could never possess these qualities to begin with, due to a lack of physical agitation which, during the act of procreation, serves to procure and awaken these two natural attributes. Alternatively, if he, occupying a dead body as his temporary vessel, expels the seed from it at the appropriate moment, it must similarly be rendered cold through its participation in the qualities of the deceased corpse from whence it issues. And regarding your inquiry as to whether these spirits are divided into sexes or not, I believe the tenets of philosophy can easily resolve a man's doubts to the contrary. For it is an immutable principle of that discipline that nothing can be divided by sex, except for such living bodies as must possess a natural seed by which to generate offspring. Yet we know that spirits possess no seed inherent to themselves, nor can they procreate with one another. Philomaths. How is it, then, that it is claimed various monsters have been conceived in such a manner? Epistemon. These tales are nothing but Anil's fabulae. I have already demonstrated to you that they possess no generative nature of their own. Moreover, it is abundantly clear that the cold nature of a deceased corpse can accomplish nothing in the way of procreation. Being thoroughly dead, just as the entirety of the body is, it lacks the natural heat and other intrinsic operations requisite to produce such an effect. Even if such a feat were possible, which would stand in utter defiance of all the laws of nature, it would breed no monster. It would yield only such natural offspring as would have been conceived between that specific man or woman and the abused party, had they both been alive and engaged in physical intimacy with one another. For the devil's role in the matter consists of nothing more than the mere transportation or expulsion of that substance. Consequently, the resulting progeny could not partake of any demonic quality. Indeed, it is within the capabilities of the devil's craft to cause a woman's belly to swell after he has abused her in this fashion. He may accomplish this either by stirring up her own bodily humors or through the application of herbs, much as we observe beggars doing on a daily basis. Furthermore, when the hour of her delivery arrives, he may force her to endure great agonizing pains, mimicking the natural course of labor, only to subtly slip into the midwife's hands sticks, stones, or some monstrous child procured from elsewhere. However, this phenomenon is merely reported and speculated upon by others, rather than being a matter of my own personal belief. Philomaths. But what is the reason that this variety of abuse is believed to be most prevalent in such wild regions of the world as Lapland and Finland, or in our own northern isles of Orkney and Shetland? Epistmen. Because wherever the devil encounters the greatest ignorance and barbarity, there he mounts his most grotesque assaults. Just as I previously provided you with the rationale as to why there are more witches among women than among men. Philomaths. Can anyone be so utterly wretched as to willingly consent to the devil's vile abuse in such a manner? Epistmen. Yes, some witches have confessed that he persuaded them to grant their willing consent, so that he might thereby ensnare them more securely within his traps. But just as the other, coarse category is to be pitied and prayed for, so is this latter group most highly to be punished and detested. Philomaths. Is not the phenomenon that we call the mare, which overtakes people while they sleep in their beds, a manifestation of these very spirits of which you speak? Epistmen. No, that is merely a natural sickness, to which physicians have given the name of incubus, derived ab incubando, because it is a thick phlegm that descends into our chest upon the heart while we sleep. This phlegm so obstructs our vital spirits and deprives us of all power, causing us to believe that an unnatural burden or spirit is lying upon us and pinning us down. Chapter 18. Argument. The description of the demoniacs and the possessed. By what reasoning the papists may possess the power to cure them. Philomaths. Well, I have now shared all my doubts with you, and you have satisfied me therein, regarding the first of these two kinds of spirits that you have conjoined. Now I wish to inquire of you regarding only two matters concerning the latter kind, by which I mean the demoniacs. The first is, by what means shall these possessed individuals be distinguished from those who are afflicted with a natural frenzy or mania? The second is, how can it be that they are remedied by the Papist Church? Since we account them as heretics, it would appear that one devil should not cast out another, for then his kingdom would be divided against itself, as Christ said. Epistmen. As to your first question, there are diverse symptoms by which this grievous affliction may be distinguished from a natural illness, specifically 3, omitting the various futile signs that the papists attribute to it. These include their raging at holy water, recoiling from the cross, an inability to endure hearing the name of God, and innumerable similar vanities that would be both tedious and pointless to recite. However, to return to those 3 symptoms of which I spoke, I consider the first to be the incredible physical strength of the possessed creature, which will far exceed the strength of 6 of the strongest and fiercest men who are not thus afflicted. The second is the extreme swelling of the patient's chest and abdomen, accompanied by an unnatural stirring and vehement agitation within them. This is joined by such an iron hardness of his sinews, so stiffly distended, that it would be impossible to pinch the skin of any ordinary person to such a degree. So mightily does the devil operate within all the members and senses of the body, being physically localized within it, even though he possesses no more power over the patient's soul and its affections than he would over any other man's. The final symptom is the speaking of various languages, which those acquainted with the patient know they have never learned, delivered in an uncouth and hollow voice, with a greater motion in the breast than in the mouth throughout the entirety of their speech. Excluded from this final symptom, however, are those who, during the time of their possession, are entirely bereft of all their senses, being possessed by a mute and blind spirit, such as the one Christ relieved in the 12th chapter of Matthew. And as to your next inquiry, it must first be questioned whether the papists, or indeed anyone not professing the one true religion, can truly relieve an individual of this affliction. Furthermore, should they possess such an ability, we must consider by what means it is possible for them. Concerning the former, my skepticism is grounded upon 2 reasons. First, it is well known that many such cases are counterfeit, contrived by the clergy to validate their corrupted religion. Second, we find by experience that few who are genuinely possessed are fully cured by them. Rather, the devil is content to temporarily release their physical torment in order to secure the perpetual damnation of the souls of so many who, through these false miracles, may be induced or confirmed in the profession of that erroneous religion. This is precisely as I explained to you previously regarding what he achieves in the false cures or the casting off of diseases by witches. As for the latter part of the argument, in the event that they can achieve this, which, with all due reverence to learned men who think otherwise, I am inclined to believe, owing to the faithful reports made by men of sound religion according to what they have witnessed. I think if this is indeed the case, I say the following may be the reasons upon which the papists exercise such power. Christ gave a commission and authority to his apostles to cast out devils, which they duly executed. The rules he required them to observe in this action were fasting and prayer, and that the action itself be performed in his name. Their power did not originate from any inherent virtue of their own, but solely from him who directed them, as was clearly proven by Judas possessing as much power in that commission as any of the rest. It is easy to understand, then, that the casting out of devils is achieved by the virtue of fasting, prayer, and the invocation of the name of God, even assuming many imperfections exist in the person serving as the instrument, just as Christ himself teaches us concerning the power that false prophets shall possess to cast out devils. It is no wonder, therefore, when the circumstances of this action are considered, that it may be possible for the papists, though erring in numerous points of religion, to accomplish this, provided they employ the correct method prescribed by Christ herein. For how is that action invalidated by their errors in other matters, any more than their baptism is invalidated by their errors in the other sacraments, and by their addition of many vain superstitions to the sacrament of baptism itself? Philomaths, surely, it is no small wonder that God would permit the bodies of any among the faithful to be so dishonored as to become a dwelling place for that unclean spirit. Epistmen. This is precisely what I stated just now, which serves to prove and strengthen my argument concerning the devil entering the dead bodies of the faithful. For if he is permitted to enter their living bodies, even while they are united with the soul, how much more will God permit him to enter their dead carrion, which is no longer a man, but merely the filthy and corruptible vessel of a man? For, as Christ says, it is not what enters into a man that defile him, but only that which proceeds and comes out of him. Chapter 19. Argument. The description of the fourth kind of spirits called the fairy. What is possible within this realm, and what is merely illusion? How far this dialogue addresses all these matters, and to what end? Philomaths. Now, I pray you, proceed to that fourth kind of spirits. Epistmen. That fourth kind of spirits, which the Gentiles referred to as Diana and her wandering court, and which amongst us was called the fairy, as I told you, or our good neighbors, constituted one of the sorts of illusions most prevalent during the era of the papacy. For although it was considered odious to prophesy by the devil, those whom these kinds of spirits carried away and instructed were thought to be the most fortunate and of the highest virtue. To speak of the many vain fables founded upon that illusion, how there was a king and queen of fairy, the magnificent court and retinue they possessed, how they exacted a tithe and duty, as it were, on all goods, and how they naturally rode and walked, ate and drank, and performed all other actions much like natural men and women. I consider this more akin to Virgil's campy ellisage than to anything that ought to be believed by Christians, except in general, as I have stated several times before, that the devil deluded the senses of various simple creatures, making them believe they saw and heard things that had no reality whatsoever. Philomaths. But how can it be, then, that various witches have gone to their deaths maintaining the confession that they were transported by the fairies to a certain hill, which, upon opening, they entered and beheld a beautiful queen, and that this queen, having been relieved of her burden, gave them a stone possessing various virtues, which has on numerous occasions been produced in judgment? Epistmen. I say to that exactly as I said before regarding the imaginary ravishing of the spirit out of the body. For may not the devil project into their fantasy, their senses being dulled and, as it were, asleep, such hills and the houses within them, such glittering courts and retinues, and whatsoever similar visions with which he pleases to delude them, and, in the meantime, while their bodies remain devoid of sensation, to convey into their hands a stone or some similar object, which he compels them to imagine they have received in such a location. Philomaths. But what do you say regarding their foretelling the deaths of various individuals, whom they claim to have seen in these places? That is, a veritable prophecy, as they term it, since they behold it while waking. Epistmen. I believe that either they have not been interrogated with sufficient rigor, having provided so simplistic a justification for their prophecy, or otherwise, I consider it equally possible that the devil may prophesy to them when he deceives their imaginations in such a manner, just as he does when he speaks plainly to them on other occasions. For their prophesying is merely achieved through a kind of vision, as it were, wherein he customarily counterfeits God among the heathens, as I explained to you previously. Philomaths. I would now like to know whether these types of spirits may only appear to witches, or if they may also manifest to any others. Epistmen. They may manifest to both, to the innocent sort either to frighten them or to appear as a better class of beings than unclean spirits truly are, and to the witches to provide a guise of safety for them, so that ignorant magistrates might not punish them for it, as I have just stated. However, just as the former group ought to be pitied for being forcibly troubled by them, so ought the latter group, who may be identified by their presuming to prophesy through them, to be condemned. That latter sort, I say, ought to be punished as severely as any other witches, and perhaps even more so, given that they go about their work with such deceit. Philomaths, and what causes these spirits to possess names so entirely different from others? Epistmen. It is the profound knavery of that same devil, who deludes the necromancers with innumerable feigned names for himself and his angels, in particular by presenting Satan, Beelzebub, and Lucifer as three distinct spirits, whereas we find the former two to be nothing but varying names given to the prince of all the rebellious angels by the Scriptures. For by Christ, the prince of all the devils is called Beelzebub in that passage, which I cited against the power of any heretics to cast out devils. By John in the Revelation, the ancient tempter is called Satan, the prince of all the evil angels. And the last, namely Lucifer, is merely adopted by allegory from the day star, so named in various places within the Scriptures on account of his excellence. I mean the prince of them in his creation before his fall. Even so, I maintain he deceives the witches by attributing to himself diverse names, as if every different shape into which he transforms himself were a distinct kind of spirit. Philomaths, but I have heard many more strange tales concerning these fairies than you have yet recounted to me. Epistmen, I act in this matter just as I have done throughout the remainder of my discourse. For since the foundation of this conference of ours arose from your inquiring of me at our meeting whether such entities as witches or spirits truly existed, and whether they possessed any power, I have therefore framed my entire discourse solely to prove that such things exist and may operate, utilizing such a number of examples as I can demonstrate to be rational, and this restrains me from delving any deeper into playing the role of a dictionary, merely to recount whatever I have read or heard on that subject, which would both surpass belief and appear rather to instruct in such unlawful arts than to disavow and condemn them, as is the fundamental duty of all Christians to do. Chapter 20. Argument of the trial and punishment of witches. What sort of accusation ought to be admitted against them? What is the cause of the excessive proliferation of their numbers in this age? Philomaths, then, to bring an end to our conference, since I observe it is growing late, what form of punishment do you believe these magicians and witches merit? For I perceive that you consider them all to be equally guilty. Epistmen, they ought to be put to death in accordance with the law of God, the civil and imperial laws, and the municipal laws of all Christian nations. Philomaths, but what manner of death, I pray you? Epistmen, it is commonly exacted by fire, but that is an indifferent matter, to be administered in every country according to its specific laws or customs thereof. Philomaths, but ought no sex, age, nor rank to be exempted? Epistmen, none whatsoever, when so administered by the lawful magistrate, for it constitutes the highest degree of idolatry, wherein no exception is permitted by the law of God. Philomaths, then children may not be spared? Epistmen, indeed, without diminishing my conclusion by a single hair, for they are not sufficiently capable of reason to practice such things. And regarding any who are merely in their company and fail to reveal it, their tender and ignorant age will undoubtedly excuse them. Philomaths, I see you condemn all those who are complicit in the counsel of such crafts. Epistmen, without a doubt, for as I stated when speaking of magic, the consulters, those who place their trust in them, the overseers, the entertainers, or the instigators of these practitioners, are equally as guilty as those who directly perform the practices themselves. Philomaths, may the prince, then, or the supreme magistrate, spare or overlook anyone who is guilty of that craft. upon some profound considerations known only to himself? Epistemon. The prince or magistrate, for the purpose of further investigation, may delay their punishment for a certain duration as he deems convenient, but ultimately to spare their lives, and to fail to strike when God commands to strike, and thus fail to punish severely so odious a transgression and treason against God, is not only unlawful, but undoubtedly no lesser a sin in that magistrate than it was in Saul's sparing of Agag. And it is entirely comparable to the sin of witchcraft itself, as Samuel alleged at that time. Philomaths. Surely, then, I believe that since this crime must be so severely punished, judges ought to exercise great caution, condemning none save those whom they are absolutely certain are guilty. Neither should the prattling report of an old crone serve as sufficient evidence in so weighty a case. Epistemon. Judges ought indeed to be deeply cautious regarding whom they condemn, for it is as grave a crime as Solomon declares, to condemn the innocent as to allow the guilty to escape freely. Neither ought the report of any single infamous person be admitted as sufficient proof, for such a standard can be upheld by no law. Philomaths. And what weight, then, might the confessions of a number of guilty persons hold against one who is accused? Epistemon. The assize must serve as the interpreter of our law in that respect. But in my estimation, since in a matter of treason against the prince, children, wives, or individuals of the most defamed character, may, according to our law, serve as sufficient witnesses and proof, I certainly believe that, by a far greater reasoning, such witnesses may be deemed sufficient in matters of high treason against God. For who apart from witches can provide proof, and thus bear witness to the doings of witches? Philomaths. Indeed, I believe they would be entirely loath to admit any honest man into their confidence. But what if they accuse people of having been present at their imaginary conventions in the spirit, while their bodies lie senseless, as you have stated? Epistemon. I believe they are not a fraction less guilty, for the devil would never have dared to borrow their shadow or likeness for that purpose, had their consent not been given to it. And consent in these matters brings death according to the law. Philomaths. Then Samuel was a witch, for the devil assumed his shape and impersonated him in delivering a response to Saul. Epistemon. Samuel was already dead prior to that occurrence, and thus no one could slander him by claiming he meddled in that unlawful art. For the reason why, as I understand it, that God will not permit Satan to assume the shapes or likenesses of any innocent persons during such unlawful occasions, is that God will not allow any innocent individuals to be slandered by association with that vile defection. For then the devil would continually find new ways to calumniate the righteous. And we have proof of this through those who are carried away by the fairies, who never see the shadows of anyone in that court, save for those who are subsequently proven to have been brothers and sisters of that craft. And this was likewise proven by the confession of a young lass, troubled with spirits, laid upon her by witchcraft, that although she saw the forms of diverse men and women tormenting her, and naming the individuals whom these shadows represented, yet never a single one of them was found to be innocent, but all were clearly proven to be most guilty, and the greater part of them confessing the same. And besides that, I believe it has seldom been recounted, that anyone whom persons guilty of that crime accused, as having known them to be their accomplices by eyesight, and not by hearsay, but such as were so accused of witchcraft, could not be explicitly proven against them, or were at the very least publicly acknowledged to possess a most wicked life and reputation. So fiercely protective is God, I say, of the renown of those who are innocent in such causes. And besides that, there are two other excellent aids that may be utilized for their trial. The first is the discovery of their mark, and the testing of the insensibility thereof. The other is their floating upon the water, for just as in a secret murder, if the deceased corpse is at any time thereafter touched by the murderer, it will gush with blood, as if the blood were crying out to the heavens for revenge against the murderer. God having appointed that secret supernatural sign, for the trial of that secret unnatural crime, so it appears that God has appointed, for a supernatural sign of the monstrous impiety of the witches, that the water shall refuse to receive them into her bosom, that have cast off from themselves the sacred water of baptism, and wilfully rejected the benefit thereof. No, not even so much as their eyes are capable of shedding tears, threaten and torture them as you please, until they first repent, God not permitting them to disguise their obstinacy in so horrific a crime, although the female sex especially is otherwise able to shed tears at every trivial occasion whenever they desire, yes, even if it be deceitfully like the crocodiles. Philomaths, well, we have allowed this conference to endure as long as leisure would permit. And to conclude then, since I am to take my leave of you, I pray God to purge this country of these devilish practices. For they were never so rampant in these parts as they are presently. Epistmen, I pray to God that it may be so. But the causes are exceedingly manifest that make them to be so prevalent. For the profound wickedness of the populace on the one part procures this dreadful defection, whereby God justly punishes sin through a greater iniquity, and on the other part, the consummation of the world, and our deliverance drawing near, causes Satan to rage all the more within his instruments, knowing his kingdom to be so near an end. And so farewell for this time. The end. Chapter 21. News from Scotland. Title page. News from Scotland. Declaring the damnable life and death of Dr. Fian, a notable sorcerer. 1591. Note: the original of this text resides within the Bodleian Library. The text, not the preface, is reproduced line for line and page for page. Pages within the original are not enumerated except by signatures. No corrections have been applied. News from Scotland. Original title page, News from Scotland, declaring the damnable life and death of Dr. Fian, a notable sorcerer, who was burned at Edinburgh in January last, 1591. Which doctor served as register to the devil that sundry times preached at North Berwick Kirk, to a multitude of notorious witches. With the true examinations of the said doctor and witches as they uttered them in the presence of the Scottish king, discovering how they conspired to bewitch and drown his majesty in the sea while returning from Denmark with such other wonderful matters as the like hath not been heard of at any time. Published according to the Scottish copy. At London. Printed for William Wright. To the reader. The manifold falsehoods which are disseminated abroad, concerning the abominable actions and the apprehension of those witches of whom the following history faithfully speaks, have compelled me to publish the same in print, and particularly because various written manuscripts have recently been circulated thereof, asserting that the aforementioned witches were initially discovered by means of a destitute peddler journeying to the town of Tranent, and that in a miraculous manner he was instantaneously transported at midnight from Scotland to Bordeaux in France, being locations of no insignificant distance between, into a merchant's cellar there, and subsequently, having been sent from Bordeaux into Scotland by certain Scottish merchants to the King's Majesty, that he exposed those witches and became the cause of their capture, with a multitude of matters both miraculous and incredible, all of which in truth are entirely false. Nevertheless, to satisfy a number of honest minds, who are desirous to be informed of the verity and truth of their confessions, which for a certainty are far stranger than the common report suggests, and yet with greater truth I have undertaken to publish this brief treatise, which declares the true discourse of all that has happened, and as well what was attempted by those wicked and detestable witches against the King's Majesty, as also by what means they wrought the same. All of which examinations, gentle reader, I have here faithfully published, exactly as they were recorded and uttered in the presence of the King's Majesty, praying thee to accept it as verity, the same being so true that it cannot be disproven. Chapter 22. News from Scotland. A true discourse of the apprehension of sundry witches recently taken in Scotland, whereof some have been executed, and some remain imprisoned, with a particular recital of their examinations, taken in the presence of the King's Majesty. God by his omnipotent power has at all times and daily does take such profound care, and is so vigilant, for the welfare and preservation of his own, that thereby he frustrates the wicked practices and evil intentions of all those who by any means whatsoever seek indirectly to conspire in any matter contrary to his holy will. Yes, and by that very same power, he has lately overthrown and impeded the intentions and wicked dealings of a vast number of ungodly creatures, who are no better than devils, who suffering themselves to be allured and enticed by the devil whom they served, and to whom they were privately sworn, entered into the detestable art of witchcraft, which they studied and practiced for so long a time, that in the end they had seduced through their sorcery a number of others to become as wicked as themselves. Dwelling within the bounds of Lothian, which is a principal shire or region of Scotland, where the King's Majesty is accustomed to make his chief residence or abode, and to the end that their detestable wickedness which they privately had intended against the King's Majesty, the commonwealth of that country, along with the nobility and subjects of the same, should come to light. God of his unspeakable goodness did reveal and lay it bare in a most extraordinary manner, thereby to make known unto the world, that their actions were contrary to the law of God, and to the natural affection which we ought universally to bear toward one another. The manner of this revelation was as follows. Within the town of Tranent in the kingdom of Scotland, there dwells a certain David Seaton, who being the deputy bailiff in the said town, possessed a maidservant named Guileless Duncan, who habitually absented herself in secret and lay away from her master's house every other night. This Guileless Duncan took it upon herself to aid all those who were troubled or afflicted with any manner of sickness or infirmity, and in a short span of time performed many most miraculous deeds, which matters forasmuch as she began to execute them with suddenness, having never accomplished the like before, caused her master and others to regard her with immense astonishment, and they marveled thereat. By means whereof the aforementioned David Seaton held his maid in profound suspicion, concluding that she did not perform these acts by natural and lawful methods, but rather presumed them to be achieved through some extraordinary and illicit means. Whereupon, her master became profoundly inquisitive, and interrogated her regarding the manner and the means by which she was capable of executing matters of such significant importance. Whereat she furnished him with no answer. Nevertheless, her master, to the intent that he might more effectively ascertain and uncover the truth of the matter, did, with the assistance of others, afflict her with the torture of the pillowinks upon her fingers, which is a grievous torment, and by binding or wrenching her head with a cord or rope, which is a most cruel agony also. Yet she would not confess anything, whereupon they, suspecting that she had been marked by the devil, as customarily witches are, conducted a diligent search of her person, and discovered the enemy's mark to reside upon her forecrag or the anterior portion of her throat. Which being discovered, she confessed that all her endeavors had been accomplished through the wicked allurements and enticements of the devil, and that she executed them by witchcraft. After this her confession, she was committed to prison, where she remained for a season, where immediately she accused these subsequent individuals of being notorious witches, and caused them forthwith to be apprehended one after another, viz. Agnes Sampson, the eldest witch among them all, residing in Haddington, Agnes Thompson of Edinburgh, Dr. Fian, alias John Cunningham, master of the school at Saltpans in Lothian, of whose life and peculiar acts you shall be informed more extensively at the conclusion of this discourse. These were by the aforementioned Gillis Duncan accused, as was also George Mott's wife residing in Saltpans, Robert Grierson Skipper, and Janet Bandelandes, alongside the porter's wife of Seaton, the smith at the Bridge Hallis, with innumerable others in those parts, and residing within those boundaries aforesaid, of whom certain individuals are already executed, the remainder tarrying in prison, to receive the doom of judgment at the King's Majesty's will and pleasure. The said Gillis Duncan also caused Euphame Meilrian to be apprehended, who had conspired in and executed the death of her godfather, and who had exercised her dark art upon a gentleman being one of the lords and justices of the session, for bearing goodwill toward her daughter. She also caused to be apprehended one Barbara Napier, for bewitching to death Archibald, the late Earl of Angus, who languished unto death by witchcraft, and yet the same was not suspected, but rather that he perished of so inexplicable a disease, that the physician knew not how to cure or remedy the same. But of all the other aforesaid witches, these latter two previously recited, were reputed to be as civil and honest women as any that dwelled within the city of Edinburgh, before they were apprehended. Many others besides were seized residing in Leith, who are detained in prison, until His Majesty's further will and pleasure be known, of whose wicked doings you shall specifically hear, which transpired as followeth. This aforesaid Agnes Sampson, which was the elder witch, was apprehended and brought to Holyrood House before the King's Majesty and sundry others of the nobility of Scotland, where she was strictly examined, but all the persuasions which the King's Majesty utilized upon her with the rest of his council could not provoke or induce her to confess anything, but she stood stiffly in the denial of all that was laid to her charge. Whereupon they commanded her to be conveyed away to prison, there to receive such torture as hath been recently provided for witches in that country. And forasmuch as by the due examination of witchcraft and witches in Scotland, it hath lately been discovered that the devil doth generally brand them with a privy mark, by reason that the witches have confessed themselves, that the devil doth lick them with his tongue in some private region of their body, before he doth receive them to be his servants, which mark is commonly bestowed upon them beneath the hair in some portion of their body, whereby it may not easily be discovered or observed, even though they be searched, and generally so long as the mark remains unseen by those who search them, just as long will the parties possessing the mark never confess anything. Therefore by special commandment this Agnes Sampson had all her hair shaven off, upon every part of her body, and her head wrenched with a rope according to the custom of that country, being a pain most grievous, which she endured for almost an hour, during which interval she would not confess anything until the devil's mark was discovered upon her privities. Then she immediately confessed whatsoever was demanded of her, and justifying those individuals aforesaid to be notorious witches. Item, the said Agnes Thompson was thereafter brought again before the King's Majesty and his council, and being interrogated concerning the assemblies and detestable dealings of those witches, she confessed that upon the night of All Hallows Eve last, she was accompanied as well by the persons aforesaid, as also by a great multitude of other witches, to the number of 200, and that they all journeyed together by sea, each one in a riddle or sieve, and travelled in the same quite robustly with flagons of wine, making merry and drinking along the way in those same riddles or sieves, unto the kirk of North Berwick in Lothian, and that after they had disembarked, they took hands upon the land and danced this reel or short dance, singing all with a unified voice. Comer go ye before, comer go ye, if ye will not go before, comer let me. At which time she confessed that this guileless Duncan did proceed before them playing this reel or dance upon a small trump, known as a Jew's trump, until they entered into the kirk of North Berwick. These confessions left the king in a profound admiration, and he sent for the said guileless Duncan, who upon an identical trump did perform the aforementioned dance before the King's Majesty, who in respect of the extraordinary nature of these matters, took immense delight in being present at their examinations. Item, the said Agnes Thompson confessed that the devil being then at North Berwick Kirk, anticipating their arrival in the habit or likeness of a man, and observing that they had tarried overly long, he at their coming enjoined them all to a penance, which was, that they should kiss his buttocks, as a token of duty toward him, which being presented over the pulpit bar, every one performed exactly as he had enjoined them, and having delivered his ungodly exhortations, wherein he did vehemently inveigh against the King of Scotland, he received their oaths for their devoted and faithful service unto him, and departed. Which done, they returned to the sea, and so journeyed home again. At which time the witches demanded of the devil why he harbored such profound hatred toward the king, who answered, by reason that the king is the greatest enemy he possesseth in the world. All of which their confessions and depositions are still extant upon the public record. Item, the said Agnes Sampson confessed before the King's Majesty sundry matters which were so miraculous and bizarre, that his Majesty declared they were all extraordinary liars, whereat she responded, she would not wish his Majesty to suppose her words to be false, but rather to believe them, in that she would reveal such intelligence unto him as his Majesty should not in any manner doubt of. And thereupon taking his Majesty a little aside, she disclosed unto him the precise words which had passed between the King's Majesty and his Queen at Oslo in Norway the first night of their marriage, with their answers to one another. Whereat the King's Majesty marveled greatly, and swore by the living God, that he believed that all the devils in hell could not have discovered the same, acknowledging her words to be absolute truth, and therefore he lent greater credence to the remainder of that which is previously declared. Touching this Agnes Thompson, she is the singular woman, who by the devil's persuasion was said to have intended and put into execution the King's Majesty's demise in this particular manner. The mother therefore, being exceedingly versed in witchcraft, concluded it most advantageous to confront the doctor through his own art, and thereupon took the paper from the boy, wherein he was supposed to have placed the aforementioned hairs, and proceeded to a young heifer which had never borne a calf nor mated with a bull, and with a pair of shears clipped 3 hairs from the udder of the cow, and wrapped them within the same paper, which she once more delivered to the boy, subsequently, instructing him to present the same to his said master, which he immediately did. The schoolmaster, as soon as he had received them, believing them indeed to be the maiden's hairs, went forth immediately and worked his magic upon them. Yet the doctor had no sooner fulfilled his intentions upon them, Then presently the heifer or cow whose hairs they truly were, arrived at the door of the church wherein the schoolmaster resided, into which the heifer entered, and advanced toward the schoolmaster, leaping and dancing upon him, and pursuing him out of the church and to whatever location he traversed, to the profound astonishment of all the townsmen of Saltpans, and numerous others who did witness the spectacle. The report of this phenomenon caused all men to surmise that he orchestrated it through the devil, without whom it could never have been so thoroughly effected. And thereupon the reputation of the said Dr. Fian, who was but a very youthful man, began to circulate so widely among the populace of Scotland that he was clandestinely identified as a notorious conjurer. All of which, although he initially denied and would not confess, yet having experienced the agony of the boots and the charm being neutralized as previously stated, he acknowledged all the aforementioned to be entirely true, without producing any witnesses to justify the same, and thereupon before the King's Majesty he subscribed the said confessions with his own hand, which for verity remains upon the official record in Scotland. After the depositions and interrogations of the said Dr. Fian alias Cunningham were recorded, as has already been declared, with his own hand willingly affixed thereto, he was by the master of the prison committed to custody, and confined to a solitary chamber, where forsaking his wicked ways, acknowledging his profoundly ungodly life, demonstrating that he had too eagerly followed the allurements and enticements of Satan, and foolishly executed his designs through conjuration, witchcraft, enchantment, sorcery, and similar practices, he renounced the devil and all his malicious works, vowed to lead the life of a Christian, and appeared newly directed toward God. The following day, upon a conference being held with him, he conceded that the devil had appeared unto him during the preceding night, apparelled entirely in black, holding a white wand in his hand, and that the fiend demanded of him whether he would continue his faithful service, in accordance with his initial oath and promise made to that effect, whom, as he then stated, he utterly repudiated to his face, and spoke unto him in this manner, Depart, Satan, depart. For I have listened too much unto thee, and by that very act thou hast ruined me, in consideration whereof I entirely forsake thee. To whom the devil answered, That at least once before thou deest thou shalt be mine. And with that declaration, as he recounted, the devil fractured the white wand, and immediately vanished out of his sight. Thus throughout the entire day this Dr. Fian remained exceptionally solitary, and appeared to harbor genuine concern for his own soul, and would invoke God, demonstrating himself to be penitent for his wicked life. Nevertheless, that very night he discovered such means, that he purloined the key to the prison door and the chamber wherein he was confined, which during the night he opened and fled away to the Saltpans, where he was permanently resident, and had been initially apprehended, regarding whose sudden departure when the King's Majesty acquired intelligence. He immediately commanded that a diligent inquiry be conducted for his apprehension, and for the more successful execution thereof, he dispatched public proclamations into all regions of his realm to that identical effect. By means of this zealous and relentless pursuit, he was once again captured and returned to prison, and subsequently being summoned before his Majesty, he was thoroughly re-examined as much concerning his escape, as also regarding everything that had previously transpired. Yet this doctor, notwithstanding that his own confession demonstrably remains upon the official record under his personal handwriting, and the same affixed thereto in the presence of the King's Majesty and several members of his council, nevertheless did utterly deny the same. Whereupon the King's Majesty, perceiving his stubborn willfulness, conceived and deduced that during the time of his absence he had entered into a fresh conference and covenant with the devil his master, and that he had been once again newly marked, for which he was meticulously searched, but such a mark could not in any manner be discovered. Yet for the further trial of his person to compel him to confess, he was commanded to undergo a most extraordinary torment, which was executed in the following manner. The nails upon all of his fingers were forcefully riven and extracted with an instrument known in Scottish as a tuckas, which in England we term a pair of pincers, and beneath every nail there were driven 2 needles over even up to their very heads. Throughout all of which torments notwithstanding the doctor never recoiled a single fraction. Neither would he then confess it any the sooner despite all the brutal tortures inflicted upon him. Then was he with all expedient haste, by royal commandment, conveyed once more to the torment of the boots, wherein he endured for an extended duration, and did sustain so many tremendous blows within them, that his legs were crushed and battered together as minutely as could possibly be, and the bones and flesh so pulverized, that the blood and marrow spouted forth in copious abundance, whereby they were rendered unserviceable forever. And notwithstanding all these grievous afflictions and cruel torments, he would not confess a single thing. So profoundly had the devil penetrated into his heart, that he utterly repudiated all that which he had previously avouched, and would declare nothing thereto save for this, that whatever he had done and spoken beforehand, was solely done and spoken out of fear of the excruciating pains which he had endured. Upon profound consideration therefore undertaken by the King's Majesty and his council, as much for the proper execution of justice upon such detestable malefactors, as also for the sake of an example, to remain a perpetual terror to all others hereafter, that shall attempt to engage in the like wicked and ungodly actions, as witchcraft, sorcery, conjuration, and such like. The said Dr. Fian was soon after arraigned, condemned, and adjudged by the law to die, and subsequently to be burned in accordance with the legislation of that land, provided in that behalf. Whereupon he was placed into a cart, and having first been strangled, he was immediately cast into a massive fire, being already prepared for that explicit purpose, and there burned upon the Castle Hill of Edinburgh on a Saturday at the conclusion of January last past, 1591. The remainder of the witches who are not yet executed remain confined in prison until further trial and the declaration of His Majesty's royal pleasure. This astonishing narrative previously recited may perhaps provide some occasion of doubt to such individuals as shall happen to read the same, and thereby cause them to conjecture that the King's Majesty would not hazard himself in the presence of such notorious witches, lest thereby there might have ensued grave danger to his royal person and the general stability of the realm, which prospect in truth might well have been feared. But to offer a general answer to such skeptics, let this suffice: that primarily it is well acknowledged that the king is the child and servant of God, and they merely servants to the devil. He is the Lord's anointed, and they nothing but vessels of God's wrath. He is a true Christian, and placeth his absolute trust in God. They are worse than infidels, for they rely solely upon the devil, who daily ministers unto them, until he has guided them to utter destruction. But hereby it is evident that His Highness possessed a magnanimous and undaunted mind, not intimidated by their enchantments, but utterly resolute in this conviction, that so long as God remains with him, he fears not who may stand against him. And truly the entire scope of this treatise so manifestly reveals the wondrous providence of the Almighty, that had he not been defended by His omnipotence and power, His Highness would never have returned alive during his voyage from Denmark, so that there is no doubt but that God would as readily defend him upon the land as upon the sea, where they plotted their damnable practice. End of the book. Demonology. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.